Got it.
Yeah.
Okay, let's go. Hi, my name is Stan Conte. Welcome to episode 3 of the MLB Baseball Injury Conference. Today we're talking about weighted balls, and we're going to do a roundtable type of procedure here. I want to first welcome a new group of people that we've invited this week. The NCAA 1 medical baseball teams have joined us. I think there's about 225 of them inside here. We kind of knew that this was going to be a popular topic. It's very contemporary in regards to what we've been talking about. And so we knew we were going to have a lot of people. We didn't think we were going to have 850 people, but that's how many people we have signed up and registered for this. So we got a good population of people. We're going to, I'm just going to share my screen here a little bit so we can get into the introductions. Okay. First of all, here's our speakers. And unfortunately, Dr. Chris Ahmad could not be here. He called me this morning. He, as most of you know, he works out of New York Presbyterian Hospital in New York City. And they're trying to reopen their hospital for non-COVID and elective surgeries. And he's on a bunch of committees to try to figure out how that's going to work safely. So he's tied up all that, although he may be able to make it later on. But we're just are assuming he's not going to make it. So we're sorry about that, but all that stuff comes first. Our speakers today are Michael Reinold from the Chicago White Sox, Glenn Fleisig back from ASMI, Anthony Brady from Driveline Baseball, Christopher Samad is not going to be here, Brandon Erickson, and Eric Cressey from the New York Yankees. The format's going to be just a little bit different today in that we're going to have a roundtable at the end of this. Each person is going to present a 7 to 8 minute presentation as opposed to the longer ones on their views of weighted balls. And then we're going to go into a question and answer. It's really, really important that you look at the Q&A on the bottom and start putting questions in as you're listening to the presentations that you may want to ask. We want to have a really good debate on this subject, and we really want to hear what you guys want these experts to be able to discuss, and that'll come from you guys. So please go ahead and start doing the Q&A in regards to that. In addition, we're going to throw in a couple different polls. Nancy Flynn right now is going to activate a poll at the bottom of your screen that talks about which organization, we're asking 3 questions. Does the organization use a formal weighted ball program? So not just that the players do one outside, but do they have a formal weighted program? Yes or no? And if so, who administers the weighted ball program? Is it an ATC, PT, strength coach, pitching coach, or somebody else? And in order to distinguish between the MLB and the college ranks, just tell us whether you're from MLB or college. So that'll go on for about 5 or 10 minutes. So as soon as it's there, go ahead and fill out that poll. That'll help us. After the presentations, we'll have another poll. This is an unfair question, but a question I'd like to ask anyway. In your personal professional opinion, do you think weighted balls are safe for adolescent players, meaning 12 to 17 years old, college players, or professional players? Just a yes and no. We recognize that there's a lot of difference in between. There's a lot of exceptions, yes, but, and no, but that is just a yes or no question. One of the things that we got from our poll last week was we have failed to have disclosures or potential conflicts of interest that should have been done on the previous 2 episodes. We've rectified that. So all the speakers will have disclaimers at the front of their PowerPoint presentations. Just so my disclosures are apparent, I'm a consultant for Major League Baseball on the medical research committees. I'm a co-owner of Conte Sports Performance Therapy in Scottsdale, Arizona, who's sponsoring this program, and Conte Injury Analytics is a baseball consulting company. Okay, so our first speaker is going to be Mike Reinold, well known to most of you. He got his BS in physical therapy at Northeastern University, doctorate in physical therapy from Massachusetts General Institute of Health Professions, board certified in sports physical therapy by the APTA, board certified in athletic training by the NATA, certified strength and conditioning specialist. He got his post-professional physical therapy fellowship from ASMI. He's published over 50 journal articles and book chapters. He has edited several books, including the Athlete's Shoulder Conditioning Programs for Baseball Pitchers, among other ones. He's a former head athletic trainer, physical therapist for the Boston Red Sox, and now holds the position of senior medical advisor for the Chicago White Sox. He has his wife and two daughters. Mike?
Awesome. Thank you, Stan. And while we're switching my video over here, I just wanted to say, obviously, thanks to Stan for putting this all together. And, you know, this takes a lot of work in the background that people sometimes don't appreciate how much effort Stan's put into this. And obviously, Nancy in the background for assisting as well. So thank you so much for making this opportunity for all of us so we can get better during this time. So how's that, Nancy? Can you see my presentation?
Yep, everything looks good.
Awesome. Good to go. Perfect. Awesome. Okay, great. Awesome. Well, so I'm going to start off and talk a little bit about the science behind the safety and efficacy of weighted ball trainings. And what we're trying to do is understand a little bit about, you know, the reality behind some of what we need to learn about weighted balls over time. With anything, right? Like most good things start and there's some optimism, right? We're seeing this with some COVID testing in the market right now. There's some optimism early on in the marketplace about the success and the pros and cons of things. And then over time, as we learn, I think we start to find what's the best way and maybe the right way to do things better as we learn and grow. And I think that's what's going to happen with weighted balls as we continue to grow. So I'm going to share a little bit about the science behind what we've learned and some of the projects that we've done over the years to kind of try to learn this a little bit. I have no disclosures other than I am currently torn between being a Tampa Bay Buccaneer fan and a New England Patriot fan. It's very confusing for us up in Boston right now. But sticking to the topic, I want to talk a little bit about weighted balls because as we've seen in the last 2 weeks of presentations with Stan and some of the things that he's gone over, we know baseball pitching injuries are going up at an alarming rate, right? And we're all trying our best. So there's 1,000 people on this, right? We're breaking the internet on Zoom tonight to go over these presentations. And for some reason, things are getting worse. So we're not doing something right. And what we do know in this era that we're in baseball is that we have this large emphasis on velocity, right? Go to any 14U perfect game tournament, and this is what the stands look like. So we're in this weird predicament now with baseball where we try to kind of navigate what we do with this increase in velocity and how we can best mitigate it to get the most out of our athletes, but also not increase their injury risk. Because we know there's a correlation between velocity and stress of the elbow and probably the shoulder too. And this has been shown at multiple levels from both high school and professional athletes. So it makes sense, right? A physics equation, the more velocity you have, the more stress you have on your elbow. That's kind of been defined over time. So if we look at a few graphs and we look at what's happened in baseball, I think the first thing we look at is just the trends in popularity, right? So what I do, I like to go to the source for data that is probably more accurate than anything else is Google. So this is a Google search trend for the keywords baseball velocity and weighted baseballs. And you can see this huge spike in the amount of people searching for baseball velocity and weighted balls, which was really non-existent before 10 years ago, before people started Googling it. right? So we see this uptick in interest in velocity, and we're also seeing this uptick in velocity in Major League Baseball, right? So this is actually a little bit older. It's actually gone up. We're over 93, almost 94 miles per hour as our mean fastball velocity in Major League Baseball. So it's no wonder when you overlay graphs of the amount of Tommy John injuries that we're seeing, right, that they tend to overlap and they look like they correlate a little bit, right? So there's definitely, you know, always the cause or the case of causation versus correlation, but I think it's pretty clear that we know velocity increases stress, and we're seeing that they're both going up. But that's the snapshot there. I want you to look at that slide there, and I want you to look at those Tommy John injuries as they go up, because when we look at some of the research that Stan's done and Dr. Camp, who spoke in these presentations as well, and we actually look at it a little bit here, believe it or not, that graph that I just showed is the red. Right. And I always ask everybody that's, you know, when I'm at a presentation, usually I'm in person, right? And I can see you and I say, you know, raise your hands if you think we're having this Tommy John epidemic, right? Because that's what everybody's saying now. Like USA Today saying it, Sports Illustrated saying it, everybody's saying it on Twitter, we have this epidemic in Tommy John. Well, Major League Baseball Tommy John injuries is that red line, right? That green line is minor league baseball. Now you want to talk about an epidemic. That is more than 3 times more than what we're seeing at Major League Baseball, and nobody's even talking about that. So we're seeing this gigantic spike. The new research that these guys also just published showed that the trends from this generation to the next generation, the current generation of players, is we're seeing more Tommy Johns, and that it's actually going up in the minor leagues, which obviously is the case when we see this, right? So that's a pretty large spike, right? It looks a lot like this to me. I always kind of show this as my highlight, right? And you see the big difference. So take a guess what this is. The green is the Dow Jones Industrial Average, and the black is Bitcoin, right? So we see these bubbles, we see these popularity bubbles as things kind of go up over time, but it starts to concern us when we start seeing things progress at an abnormal rate, right? Does that make sense? So we've had this emphasis on velocity. Training has been focused on velocity. So obviously weighted balls become a hot topic on that, right? And it's not fair to say weighted balls are a velocity program, right? Because it's just a small part of it. I think we all would agree with that, right? But weighted balls are a big thing that we talk about, and that's the topic for tonight. So we're going to focus a little bit on that. So before we even get into some of the safety, let's talk about the efficacy, right? So the question is, do weighted balls work? If I was to ask everybody in the crowd right now, do weighted balls work? I think that would be your response, right? I think that's what everybody would kind of say, right? They'd say like, yeah, no, of course weighted balls work. That's, yeah, I've been hearing that for years. I definitely think weighted balls work, right? So it's interesting when we kind of dig into some of the past studies, there are plenty of studies that have shown a significant increase in velocity. And I'm one of them. In the study we published in Sports Health in 2018, a few years ago, we actually showed a 3.3% increase in velocity. And I would say that most people would say about, give or take, 3% is a fair rise in velocity over time. Dr. Erickson is also on this presentation. We're going to talk about his study a little bit too, and I know he's going to elaborate on that, but they showed a 7.3% increase with their weighted ball study. Although it was a bunch longer and it actually was a nice comprehensive program. It was a bunch of different things in there. We're seeing that. But if you really want to go look and dig in deep, you can see the study by Dr. Caldwell and Dr. Ahmad that just did a systematic review of the studies that were out there in 2019. You can kind of go through some of the past studies. We're going to talk about those a little bit. But one of the big things to point out here is most of these, the balls are ranging from 4 to 17 ounces. To be honest with you, most of them, there are 4 to 6 ounces. That's what we've studied scientifically, right? And we know that both under and overload may be effective, but hold on for a second. Let's look a little bit deeper at some of these things. Most of the studies on weighted balls are old. Look at those. They're in the 60s, 70s. I don't even know if that's valid, right? Who knows what research was like then, right? Because I know research 20 years ago was a lot different than it was then. But a lot of those are pretty old, right? There's only been 3 in the last 10 years. The last 30 years, there's only been 3 studies really that have looked at weighted ball training, and kind of, you again, see the difference over time. So I don't know if we can definitively say that we have a ton of research that shows it increases velocity, right? Most of these, keep in mind, are poor quality too. If you actually look at them, they're all low to very low quality, except for ours. Very randomized control trial is always going to have a little bit more of a quality grade for that. But most of them were very low quality to even say that they're very accurate or something that we can use to determine an efficacy in a study. But the hard thing is, this is really hard to control. Most of the research we do in our fields, in rehab and medicine and sports performance, it's super hard to control, right? We're not rats. We don't go sit in a cage and do nothing. And those rats over there are doing weighted balls and those rats aren't, right? It's not that hard, right? And I think the perfect example of this is Dr. Erickson's study. So they just published this, it was a couple of weeks ago, I think now, and I'm sure he's going to talk about it a little bit, but youth pitchers, so a little bit younger of a study, but they didn't have a control group. So it's super hard to say that the weighted balls were the reason why they gained their velocity. But it was a super comprehensive program. And I think, kudos to Dr. Erickson. I can't wait to hear a little bit more about the study, because the study was amazing. The people went up 7.3, I believe, percent velocity. But to say it was a weighted ball program, I think is actually, to be honest, a disservice to the program. The program was actually way better than a weighted ball program. So if you dig in deep to the methodology, it was 15 total weeks. They had 25 sessions where they came in over the 3.5 months, 25 times. They didn't even use weighted balls until halfway through. They started them in the 12th session. And out of the entire 3.5 months, they only used weighted balls 9 times. So not a knock on the study. The study is outstanding, that it shows a really well-designed program for youth that has strength, med ball routines for power and the right development. And it was a well-designed, like the appendix is amazing. They have all these great exercises in there that develop power. But to be honest with you, I don't think it tells us that training with lighter balls helps velocity or decreases injury or isn't an increase of injury. I don't think it tells us either of those without a control group and not following those subjects into the next season. It tells us that if we do a well comprehensive program, we're going to get some great outcomes. And weighted balls may be part of that. I think that's a big thing. But if you're on Twitter and you just read that headline, I think that's going to be pretty confusing. The other thing to keep in mind here is that not everyone sees gains. I think we keep that in mind. If we just look at this study right here, just look at those right there. 4 out of the 11 studies show that there were no significant difference in weighted ball training programs. In fact, the one done by Driveline itself, and obviously I want to hear Dr. Brady on this a little bit here, but Driveline didn't even show an increase in velocity, right? And they're probably the ones that the biggest trendsetters that kind of showed that. And again, Driveline, amazing comprehensive programs that do so much for pitching development. I think honestly, I think it's a disservice to Driveline and Dr. Erickson's study to say those are weighted ball programs. They're comprehensive baseball programs, right? Weighted balls are just a small part of that. If you look in deeper into our study too, I think it's actually interesting to see here, the weighted ball group went up, right? If you look at the statistics of the means, because that's what you do in a study, right? 80% of the kids in our study went up, 12% went down. Right? And I think anecdotally, I see that all the time. But in the control group, 67% of these kids went up too. And 14% of them went down. They had more that didn't change over time. So yes, when you look at the means, by all means, weighted balls were definitely more effective than not doing weighted balls in our study, even when we had a very finite independent variable that we manipulated with the weighted balls, and they did all the other studies the same. They had that, right? But I think what we're doing a little bit, we see here with my control group and Dr. Erickson's study, is we got to keep in mind here that some of these kids are developing still, especially in their study. They had subjects down to 10 years old, right? Ours was more the high school age. But if you look at that, if you think there's studies that show for every inch you grow, your velocity goes up 1.5 miles per hour. And for every year you age, it goes up almost 1.5 miles per hour, right? So in the course of our studies that happen over a winter, if a kid has a 2-inch weight gain in a quarter of a year, I mean, he's going to go up 3 miles just because of that alone, right? So there's so many factors that go into this. It's so hard to control, but I think most people will agree that not everybody gains. Some people actually go down. And I think we have to understand that, right? We're getting so excited that we're seeing like, wow, this magical thing. Yeah, weighted balls may be effective enhancing velocity in some, but probably not as much as we think. It's not magic. We love to highlight the unicorns on social media or in the media and say like, wow, this guy went up 10 miles per hour. No way he went up 10 miles per hour from weighted balls. That's like that. Again, it's a disservice to all the other things he did, right? And I know all the people that have facilities, like trainers, the strength coach in this room, right? We get a guy, we get him a new strength program. They work with the pitching coaches. They're working on some new efficiency in their mechanics, some different things. We're getting their shoulder bulletproof. And then, oh yeah, they did like a little weighted ball program. And then his velo goes up. You know what he's telling the media? He's like, yeah, I did a weighted ball program and my velocity went up. It was amazing, right? And we're all sitting in the background being like, hey, I think there was a bunch of other things that may have went into that. But we're taking a huge leap here based on limited evidence. And I think that's kind of the point we're getting. I wonder if almost now we're all just we've been told so much that weighted balls are safe and effective, but are they is really the question. We really don't know. We don't know the mechanism of the velocity increase. We don't know the kinematic and kinetic changes, although Dr. Fleisig is going to talk about him trying to solve some of that and learning some of these things. But more importantly, we just don't know the safety because we don't know the dosage. We don't know the best way to do these just yet and where to fit these into the program. So that's where we started with our research. So we wanted to take a 6-week weighted ball program that we built based on what we saw. I trained hundreds of kids a winter, right? And if you really think about it, I say this humbly, but I have a very unique experience here. I work with hundreds of high school kids of every winter. I work with tons of college kids. I work for a D1 college program. I work for pro guys in the winter. I work for a Major League Baseball team in the summer. I see kids from every level. I see everybody. I see the anecdotal stuff. I'm also fortunate that I get to see the kids that are looking for performance enhancement, and I also see them when they get injured. So I think I have a very unique, broad view at all these things. So I wanted to create a program that simulated what we saw that our kids were doing, the programs that they were showing us. So we published just a couple of years ago in the Journal of Sports Health, and a couple of interesting things happened with this. We won 2 awards, actually, right? We won the 2019 AOSSM award for the best research paper of the year. It was actually the #1 downloaded PDF or paper from Sports Health that year. The other award we won was the 2019 Most Hitted by Pitching Coaches on Twitter award, right? And what everybody wanted to just break it down and criticize it and nitpick it here. And it's really hard to do that with a randomized control study. So we're going to talk about some of the little criticisms that we saw in the program. But believe it or not, this is what we're seeing. We based the program on what we're seeing. I didn't make this up. We based it on the things that we were seeing. So we looked at 44 youth baseball players between 13 and 18. The mean was actually higher than that, closer to 18. We had a weighted ball group and we had a control group. That was super important. We measured their range, their strength, their velocity, and the valgus stress and angular velocity from the MODIS sleeve during these programs. We did it before and after the 6-week program. They trained 3 times a week, and we used a variety of balls from 2 ounces to 32 ounces that gradually went up in intensity and quantity over the time of the program. We didn't just jump straight in with a very aggressive program. We had a control group that did a very similar kind of program, but just with 5-ounce balls, and they all trained with us. So they were strength conditioning, arm care, all those fun things. The important thing I wanted to talk about is we had a gradual ramp up. So we used kneeling, rocker, run and gun, and you can see the intensity and the different types of exercises progressed over the course of the presentation or the course of the program. The first week, there's just 3 throws with each weight at 75% effort from their knee. That's not a lot of intensity, guys, right? So just to kind of keep in mind, a lot of people criticize this was too intense, right? But you kind of go through the program. This is actually much more mild than what we're actually seeing the players. And it's just in 6 weeks. Right. So keep that in mind. If we're using balls like in different positions, like pivot pickoffs, reverse and stuff like that, there's so many things. You start using a ball that's 2, 3, 4, 5 pounds, even if you're doing it at partial percentage, that's an enormous amount of stress on the arm. So keep that in mind. So one of the big things that people like to highlight from our study was like, well, they did 2-pound running guns. I mean, who would do that? That's crazy. Well, believe it or not, kids are doing that. And I don't know whose fault it is, but trust me, the kids are doing it, right? So we're seeing the kids, we're coming in, people are telling them to do it. These things are what's happening in the real world. But I want to point this out. Over the course of 6 weeks, there's 540 total throws. They did 2-pound running guns 18 times over 6 weeks, right? So instead of like focusing on the 3% of our study, I think we should focus on the 97% of the study. I think that's a little bit more realistic. So what did we show? Again, we showed that they went up in velocity, right? We saw that 80% improved in velocity. The control group did not, even though we did have a bunch of kids that did go up in velocity, but it did go up. So we definitely did see that. We found no significant difference in peak valgus stress or angular velocity of the arm. So the arm speed did not increase, and peak valgus stress didn't go up. We're going to talk about peak. I kept saying peak several times for a reason. We're going to get to that. What we did find, though, was that range of motion increased. So in the weighted ball group, their external rotation and thus their total rotational motion went up by 5 degrees. Okay, that's the mean. Okay, there was no different in the non-dominant arm and the control group. Okay, so they did not change in their range of motion, even though they threw 5-ounce balls. Okay. For strength, we showed that there was a significant increase in external rotation of the shoulder in the control group, not the weighted ball group. In fact, they went up 13%. We were enormously proud of those kids and our programs for being able to develop 13% external rotation strength in our kids in 6 weeks. We thought that was amazing. But unfortunately, the weighted ball group did not see that, even though they did the same program. So that was unfortunate. For injuries, we did see 4 injuries. That's 24% of the subjects. 2 of them during the study, a UCL sprain and an olecranon stress reaction, and then 2 in the upcoming season that ended up needing Tommy John surgery, and we had 2 olecranon stress fractures. So that's a lot. right? And I will say this, right? The two that we saw in season that we then measured, we removed them from the study and excluded them, but we then measured them. They actually went up 10 degrees of external rotation, right? So the mean was 5. Those guys went up 10. There were no injuries in the control group. And remember, we followed them into the next season. That's super important to keep in mind. You can't say, like, most kids don't get hurt doing a weighted ball program in the winter. What happens is they gain this external rotation, probably they increase their velocity, and then in the next subsequent season, they end up getting their injury. That's what we see. So if you don't look at it into the upcoming season, I think you're missing a big window from that. So our big thing from this, we actually said, oh, wow, I think we figured it out. I think this increase in layback, this external rotation may be a big part of this. So we started looking at this with the acute effects of weighted balls. So we looked at 17 pitchers now. They came in 3 times. We had an underload day where they threw from 2, 4, and 5 ounce balls, a light overload day up to 9 ounces, and a heavy load day with 16 and 32 ounces. And we looked at the acute change in their range of motion before and after that one session, not over 6 weeks. We wanted to look at the acute changes. We also looked at stress and velocity from those positions. So Dr. Fleisig is going to talk about this. I'm not going to cover it much, but velo went down when the ball went up, of course. Stress went down when the ball went up, of course. Again, it's just physics, right? But remember, peak stress is not what we should be focused on, right? I'll let Dr. Fleisig kind of talk about this, but peak stress isn't really what we need. But here's the thing that really alarmed us. Here's the change in range of motion acutely after these programs. These kids threw the ball like, I think it was 27 times, including their warm stuff. It was 27 throws in like 5-10 minutes, right? And if you used light overload balls, just up to 9 ounces, you went up external rotation at almost 4 degrees in like 10 minutes. But if you use the heavy balls, you went up over 8 degrees, right? So keep that in mind. I've been measuring shoulders for over 20 years. I've been doing it the same way for 20 years. Lenny's been measuring it with me for 20 years, right? We're measuring these kids after the heavy balls, and I literally looked over at them like this. I'm like, oh crap. I mean, these are our kids, right? These aren't subjects, right? These aren't rats in a cage. These are our kids. You're like, oh my God, in 10 minutes, these kids went up almost 10 degrees of external rotation. So what did we learn? Well, weighted ball programs do not do a bunch of things. We haven't shown that they change pitching mechanics. Dr. Fleisig is going to talk about that there too. I know a lot of people said, well, if you do these drills, you can shorten up arm action, stuff like that. Maybe. I think if you do those drills for the same amount of reps of 5 ounces, you may get some positive outcomes too, something to keep in mind. They do not increase arm speed and they do not increase arm strength. In fact, they could probably inhibit the development of strength of your rotator cuff. It's not a good thing. They may be effective at increasing velocity, but probably not in everybody, right? But how do you gain that velocity is really the thing. For us, we think it's the layback and external rotation. Science tells us this. Biomechanics tell us this. Stress tells us this. It's obvious for us, and we've seen it now in our 2 studies, right? So we know that this layback correlates to velocity, but we know it also correlates to increased shoulder and elbow forces, right? So the question is, yes, you went up in velocity, but what cost, right? This is crazy. That's not good for you, right? So the more layback we get, the more stress we're going to see. In our programs, again, we saw a large acute change in range of motion and a cumulative chronic change when you look at the 2 programs put together. But keep this in mind, from my perspective, the injuries we're seeing are alarming, right? Both the quantity and the quality. We're seeing more and more injuries, and the type of injuries have changed. 20 years ago when I first started working in this business, we had things, it was like rotator cuff, it was like chronic degenerative type things. We're seeing acute injuries in kids now. We're seeing lat tears, teres tears, subscap tears, pec tears. How do you tear a pec pitching? That's unbelievable, right? Rib fractures, all these things that we're seeing. Everybody has TOS, it seems, right? We're seeing all of these injuries now, and these more aggressive types of injuries. And the quantity is alarming. I can't tell you how many programs near us in the college setting start a program one season. They start it off, just first time they see it, and then boom, we've had some 5 and 6 Tommy Johns in one college team in one winter, right? And we're rehabbing all these, so we know exactly what's happening. So keep that in mind. The question is, are we pushing past the physiological limits? Are we not really taking a break from throwing? I think that's a big one too, right? Dr. Fleisig's group in ASMI, they showed if you pitch for more than 8 months out of the year, you're 5 times more likely to get hurt. 500%, that's enormous, 5 times more. So yeah, we're not pitching anymore, but we're doing long toss, we're doing weighted balls, we're even just doing weighted balls against the wall. Remember, your body doesn't care what you're doing for a throw. It just cares about the stress. Those count. And weighted balls are equal to, if not more stressful than pitching. So you got to count that. I ask all my guys, hey, would you throw a bullpen 3 times a week all winter? They'd say, no way. I say, why not? And they're like, well, that's way too much. That's overload. I'm like, well, you're kind of doing the same thing with the stress. You just got to keep that in mind. But really the question I was asked is like, are we focusing on the wrong thing, right? Great study just came out. Dr. Raphael and Escamilla and Aguinaldo really looked at this, and I think they did a really good job. They showed that 86% of the velocity that comes out of the throw comes from angular velocity from trunk flexion and rotation, not the arm. So if we're working on arm stuff with like weighted balls, we're focusing on the 14%, where we're leaving a lot of things on the table. So look, are weighted balls evil? No, of course they're not evil. We all use weighted balls. I use weighted balls. I think everybody uses weighted balls to an extent. Are we using them too much? Maybe. I think we're overdosing a little bit with them. I don't think we know the appropriate dose or what to do. I think that's an important thing. I think we're probably assuming that they're good for everybody when they're not, and we're assuming that they're helpful and effective for everybody when they're not. So what can we do? And I'll kind of leave it at this. We kept talking about these upward curves that we keep seeing, right? These are the Tommy John injuries. So here's my proposals to you. And I'm kind of in jest with them, but I'm kind of serious at the same time. We need to flatten the Tommy John curve. I think that's super important right now, right? If we're looking at the number of Tommy John cases over the course of a career, if we don't do anything right now with the aggressiveness and what we're seeing with these things, all of our kids without any protective measurements, they're not going to get past their high school, college, or minor league career. They're never going to have a good Major League Baseball career if we don't flatten this curve. So what do? I don't know. Our current generation is probably too late, but if we can start getting this information to the youth, if we can start teaching them all the good things that the rest of the presenters are going to talk about today, I think we can start focusing on the right things. Thank you very much.
Hi, thanks. Okay, our next speaker is Glenn Fleisig. Sorry. Okay. Nancy, are we up?
Yep. No, not your slides aren't.
Sorry.
Hey, Stan, while we're waiting, I want to point out that there's a Q&A button on the bottom. There's also a chat button on the bottom. And people should hit the Q&A button if they have questions, not the chat button.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, the Q&A is better. It just gets too confusing with two different things coming in. Okay, Glenn's up next. He spoke last week. We're going to go kind of quickly over his introduction here because we had BS in Mechanical Engineering and Mass Institute of Technology, MIT. Served as a research intern at USOC in 1984, got his master's in mechanical engineering at Washington University in St. Louis, PhD at the University of Alabama, Birmingham, and then he was offered an opportunity to head up a research to Dr. Andrews in this new startup called ASMI. Worked out pretty good. He's an adjunct professor at University of Alabama at Birmingham, fellow International Society of Biomechanics and Sports Medicine. He's the chair of USA Baseball Medical and Safety Committee, pitching safety consultant for Little League Baseball and softball, and he's an injury research advisor for Major League Baseball. Numerous studies, but his highlight really is the committee work with Little League and Baseball and USA Baseball Pitch Smart program. And he has really championed the guidelines for pitch counts in the adolescents. This is his daughter, Julie and Emily, and his wife, Clara. Glenn?
Okay, so now
You can go ahead and share your screen.
share my screen. Okay, gotcha. Okay, hit this button, and hit this button, and optimize, click that. 1 second, and share. Okay, it's good to be back here for episode 3 of this virtual baseball injury conference. Let me see if I can start this. Yeah. Here we go. Nancy, it looks good?
Yep, you're all set.
Okay, so anyway, back for virtual baseball injury conference, episode 3, weighted ball program. Harmony and prosperity have spread throughout the baseball galaxy since the dark rage of steroids times a generation earlier, but now a new controversy has arisen in baseball training, known as weighted balls. Biomechanics are strong in me, and I will show how to use the force and torque in weighted ball throwing. All right, so here are my disclosures. I am an advisor for Major League Baseball, and I was previously a consultant with Modus from 2014 to 2018. Okay, so as Mike was talking about, Mike showed a lot of excellent data about what happens when you use weighted baseballs. But I'm going to focus on what are the forces and torques and motions when you do throw weighted baseballs. And so we could not only understand what happens when you use them, but understand what happens when during the actual moment you're using them. So there are really three hypotheses that the biomechanics research looks at. One is the hypothesis that the mechanics when you throw weighted baseballs are similar to the mechanics when you pitch. The other thing we're trying to do or believe is that when you throw a heavier baseball, your arm forces and torques will be greater because you're throwing a heavier mass item. And the other hypothesis is that when you throw a lighter ball, it's lighter, so your ball velocity goes up and your arm speed will go up. So essentially, I think the concept of weighted balls is you use the heavier ball to build strength and use the lighter ball to build arm speed. Well, there have been two recent biomechanics papers that have looked at weighted baseballs, and I'm going to present them. The first one was by our group, and the second one was by Eric Mockney and his group up in Michigan. So let's take a look at the first one. In our study, we had 25 high school and collegiate pitchers who were all healthy and were experienced with using weighted baseballs. And we had them throw 6 different types of balls in a randomized order in our lab. We had them throw 4-ounce, 5-ounce, 6-ounce, and 7-ounce balls. Of course, 5 ounces are the standard baseball at all levels. And then the yellow one was supposed to be a 1-pound rubber ball, and the green one's supposed to be a 2-pound, but when we weighed them, they're actually 14 ounces instead of 16 ounces. And the green one was 2 pounds, 32 ounces. Anyway, what we had them throw, pitching from a mound, we had them pitch 4, 5, 6, and 7-ounce baseballs. And then we did flat ground run and gun type throws with 4, 5, 6, and 7-ounce balls. And then for the 14-ounce or 14-ounce and 32-ounce balls, we had them do some flat ground hold drills. And again, the order of all these were randomized. I want to show you quickly what this looked like. This is one of the pitchers. You can see the reflective markers on his body we use for the motion analysis. And you can see he's pitching from the mound. And you can get a general, this is a regular weight baseball, 5-ounce baseball. And you have a general feel of how his mechanics look. And now here is the same pitcher throwing the flat ground run and throw, again, of using the 5-ounce in this video example. And then the final video I'm going to show here is the hold with the 2-pound ball. So again, there's no run up. It's on flat ground with no running. This is the 2-pound throw, well, hold. You're going to see he's going to go through the pitching type motion, but he's going to, when he comes through, he's going to hold on to the ball and not let go of it. So you can see we had the reflective markers on his body. And in our lab here, we had plenty of room for the 60 feet 6 inches. We have our motion capture system, Motion Analysis Corporation, which gets digitized information like this. We also use a radar gun to get the ball speed, and we have these high-speed video cameras to make the videos that we just saw. The motion analysis system, which is collected over here, from that we collect 8 position parameters for every throw, and then 5 velocities, the ball velocity, and then arm and trunk angular velocities, and then 5 kinetics, some forces and torques at the elbow and the shoulder. And what we found out was the body mechanics. I think Mike Reinold made a comment about this, but what we found was that there were no significant differences between throwing the 4, 5, 6, and 7-ounce balls. There were differences, however, between all the throws that were pitches on a mound versus the flat ground crow hop throws. In particular, the trunk mechanics were different, and the front leg mechanics were different. Also, when we looked at those heavy balls with the holds, it was a totally different game. All the mechanics were different when throwing those heavier balls, well, when going through the heavy ball drills. As far as the velocities go, as hypothesized, as the ball weight decreased, the lighter balls had increased ball velocity and had increased trunk, shoulder, and elbow angular velocities. Also, as far as velocities go, the pelvis and the shoulder actually had greater angular velocities on those flat ground throws than from pitching. So there were some differences there. The trunk, shoulder, and elbow velocities were all much slower with the heavy ball, with the holds. Now again, they're told to go through a full throwing motion, but something in your head or your body mechanics, you don't. You go with a little slower motion. Now, if we look at the forces and torques, I have a graph over here, and what we found was that the forces and torques were greater in the flat ground throws than in the pitching. So you can see here, for instance, with the standard weight 5-ounce ball, the green line is the run and throw in the flat ground, and had more elbow varus torque, which is what this graph is, than the flat ground than the pitching. And you can see, regardless of what weight ball, the green line was always higher. So flat ground throwing produces more torque at the elbow and at the other joint and at the shoulder as well. As the ball weight increased, the forces and torques on the elbow and shoulder decreased. Now, this is the exact opposite of our hypothesis. We thought as the ball got heavier, the peak torque on the elbow and shoulder would be greater, but it actually went down. You can see here between 5, 6, 7 ounces of pitching, you can see that's a significant drop in the amount of torque on the elbow. And you know, if you think about it, you would think heavier ball should be more force, but really, there's a guy named Isaac Newton who said force equals mass times acceleration, and then the angular equation like that is torque equals moment of inertia times angular acceleration. But the point of these equations is that yes, the 4 to 5 to 6 to 7, the mass of the ball goes up a little, but what we measured was the acceleration of the arm motion went down a lot. So a little heavier ball multiplied by a lot slower arm motion equaled a decrease actually in the force and torque at the elbow and shoulder. The other study by Okaroha, which is Eric Machny's group, they just came out with this article recently. And what they did was they looked at youth baseball pitchers. They averaged 12 years old, and they did not, in their lab, they did not have a mound, so they just pitched from flat ground. And they used a radar gun, as this dude over here is holding. Let's see. Here's the radar gun to measure ball speed. And then they used a Motus sleeve, which is this little sensor that goes in the sleeve, and this measures the torque on the elbow. So this study did not look at the full body mechanics. It looked at essentially the relationship between ball speed and elbow torque. And what they found was that they used different weight balls, of course, and as ball mass went down, ball velocity went up on their radar gun. They found that as ball mass went up, elbow torque went up. Okay, so let me just get rid of this thing here. You can see here's their data over here, and they started with a 3-ounce ball, and I made this dot heavier because that's the standard 5-ounce ball. And you can see they had a gentle trend here, but it was significant that as the ball got a little heavier, the torque on the elbow got a little higher. Now, if I superimpose the Fleisig results here, we'll use the motion analysis system. Again, we found that as the ball weight went up, the elbow torque went down. And trying to resolve the differences between these two, I think a couple of things are of interest. First of all, our torques are a lot higher than theirs, because we had average 18-year-old kids, and they were pitching from a mound. And they had 12-year-old kids throwing from flat ground. So 18-year-olds make more force, torque, and also on the mound, I think it's more realistic throwing 60 feet, 6 inches. Also, another point is we use the motion analysis, which is really the gold standard for measuring torque. And this uses the Motus. I think the Motus is pretty reliable, but if I were to bet, I'm betting on motion analysis of adult pitchers as really more meaningful to our audience of high school, college, and pros. Okay, so in conclusion, putting it all together from both those studies, if we look at the mechanics, I think using 4, 5, 6, and 7 ounce balls, both from mound and from flat ground, are variations on pitching, and they're not that different, and I think they are reasonable exercises to use. Now, less than 4 ounces, we didn't test less than 4 ounces in our study, but I'm concerned that as you get too light, the ball, you have a very sharp torque, and as we saw, the arm acceleration might be too great, and especially from the run and gun. So I personally would recommend not using balls less than 4 ounces, particularly run and gun with balls less than 4 ounces. Now, I know these heavy balls are used 1 pound, 2 pound balls, and I couldn't prove any difference that made it see what they're doing that's good. 1 and 2 pound balls, the mechanics are so far different than pitching. And in fact, most of the kinetics, like elbow varus torque, is much less from the lower arm speed than it is in pitching. And the joints velocities are less. So I'm not really sure what these 1 and 2 pound balls add into the program. Okay, thanks, Stan. I'll turn it back over to you.
Great, thank you. So we can share our screen here. Next speaker, we're happy to have Anthony Brady. He's the lead biomechanist at Driveline from 2008 to current. He's worked with teams across the country and all over the world, including Dominican and Japan. He's on the board of directors of the American Baseball Biomechanics Society, and he has the distinct pleasure or problem with having 2 Tommy John surgeries back to back while in college. So he understands the forces that occur on his elbow. He has a BS in exercise science from University of Puget Sound, a master's in biomechanics from the University of Northern Colorado. He has a CSCS and was a pitcher for the UNC Bears in 2018. That wasn't that long ago. So here he is. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Go ahead and share my screen. Yep. All right, should be up there.
Yep, go ahead.
All good? Cool. Yeah. Thank you for that. Also, just want to thank Nancy and Stan again for putting this on. I think it's really incredible, and mainly just I'm incredibly appreciative for the opportunity to be on this panel with the other names here, Glenn and Mike and everyone here. Got through undergrad reading your papers and your articles to understand throwing science, research, biomechanics, and even to be on the same panel as Eric Cressey is pretty cool, because his blog was kind of the first thing that I came across in 2014, 2015, and started to get into strength and conditioning, baseball development. Actually applied for the 2016 internship with Cressey Sports Performance. Didn't get it, but was fortunate to land on my feet. So this is really cool, and I'm really grateful to be able to share, today just going to talk about kind of my experience as a player, as Stan mentioned, with weighted balls. Also talk about how we go about things at Driveline, where weighted balls kind of like fit into that, how we use them and what we do there, and then some considerations that we use and follow during our programming. So with that, getting into the conflict of interest, the disclosure, obviously I am currently employed by Driveline Baseball. We sell various underload and overload implements, products, weighted balls, and plyo care balls specifically. And, Driveline Baseball pays my salary, funds the research projects and initiatives that I work on. So obviously there is a conflict of interest there with talking about weighted balls and this topic specifically. Beyond being the head biomechanist at Driveline and the work that I do there, though. I consider myself a sports scientist and a researcher above that, along with, everyone else on this panel. It's actually from a picture from the Northwest Regional ACSM conference in 2016, my senior year, when I got to present a decent independent research project on the effects of post-pitching recovery methods, looking at velocity, soreness, and discomfort in youth pitchers. I was actually comparing jogging versus sprinting based on a blog that I'd read by an intern from Cressey Sports Performance, I think back in 2014, 2015. And I think that's an important piece because being a researcher above, my title and role at Driveline is really important to me. That's kind of one of the things that I do within the R&D department, is objectively look at the way that we do things and evaluate our programs and how well they're actually doing at making players better, beyond just, how can we sell a product, create revenue, et cetera. And going even one step further, above being a researcher, sports scientist, I'm a baseball player. Have always been, always will be. This is actually a clip from last year. I still play today. I was fortunate to be able to play for 6 years of college baseball with injuries and surgeries riddled throughout. But even going past that, get to play on a semi-pro summer baseball team called the Seattle Studs. It's actually from the NBC World Series last year. That's me on the mound closing out the championship game and getting the save for that just last August. And I miss baseball so much, but I think both of those are kind of important to mention because I have a pretty unique experience of using weighted balls as a player, as a trainee. I'm trying to make myself better, but also objectively looking at it from a scientific lens and trying to evaluate, the efficacy of what they do for player development. And with that, going to start with my personal experience because I do think it's a good place to start. It was before I really understood the science of weighted balls. I showed up to Driveline following my 2 Tommy John surgeries in 2016, still having lingering arm pain, not necessarily being able to get my velocity back, was experiencing discomfort whenever I threw, had to take, multiple deloads and take time off occasionally, and was looking for an opportunity to continue to train, better myself, and try to play baseball at a Division I level while also getting my master's degree. And that's how I actually came across Driveline baseball. When I started the program and understood it and was given the drills and what to do and was onboarded into it, one of the first things that was mentioned to me was that it was going to help me clean up my arm action. And Glenn and Mike already discussed some of the things with that, the idea that weighted balls can do that. And I think there's a sort of a misconception because weighted balls, as just a statement, there's a lot of things that can fall into the weighted ball category. I mean, are we talking anything above a 5 ounce, a 6, 7, 8, 9? Are we going into the 2 pound ball, the 4 pound ball? All of those are weighted. So as far as cleaning up arm action, the idea behind the, I guess like super overload balls, the 2 pound, the 4 pound ball, with using those at lower intensities, lower arm speeds, and just the constraint of that weight, that contextual interference is going to, it was going to put the arm into a more efficient position because it's really hard to throw that heavy of a ball inefficiently within the constraints of the drill. There are ways you could do it poorly. And again, as like most things that the other presenters have mentioned, and as I'll mention, it's more nuanced than it is. There are considerations throughout, but that was a primary consideration early on. Another thing was increasing throwing fitness. The weighted balls, at least the programming was used for having kind of a stable endpoint at the beginning and the end of my workout as a warm-up and as a recovery modality to get my arm in a better place to throw acutely for that day, and then also chronically over time, just continuing to increase my throwing volume, my training fitness, so that I could handle longer bouts of training, of throwing, etc. And I'd be lying if I said that in 2016 I wasn't, there and throwing a Driveline to gain a little velocity and be able to throw harder. That was a pretty key piece for what I was looking for, especially with my lack of velocity that I had coming back from surgery. And I think one thing, and this is very anecdotal, but I didn't quite understand or appreciate it at the time. At least immediately, was that the training program actually gave me post-injury confidence. I dealt with a lot of post-injury anxiety, which I'm sure as many of you have talked to players or dealt with them, you'll understand that exists. And, as someone who had back-to-back Tommy John surgeries, tore my UCL twice, after those surgeries and getting back healthy, every time I was on the mound, there is that lingering anxiety of, am I going to blow out my UCL again on this pitch? One thing that the weighted balls did for me in training with them and using that program and going through that like intense strengthening and really pushing myself as an athlete to the limits as far as intent and what my body can handle, gave me confidence on the mound that I wasn't going to blow out my elbow for the third time, that I was going to be able to, throw, that I was strong enough, that I'd put myself into efficient positions. So I think that piece is really important from an athlete perspective and valuable for them, the way that it could potentially give them, confidence, maybe conquer some psychological issues and anxiety post-injury. At least it was very effective at doing that for me. And that clip is actually from my last bullpen in 2016 summer Driveline. First time I hit 90 miles an hour again post-surgery, 3 years out of my second Tommy John. So very, very special moment. Obviously, anecdotally have a lot of user experience with the product. And following kind of like my experience as a player and getting more into the understanding of the science of weighted balls, I won't talk much about it from kind of like a broader picture and also like in depth, because I think actually Glenn and Mike did a great job. And even, Glenn's study is on here as well. I think this one for me, which Mike referenced some reviews as well, was big. The 2009 review from Duran and Szymanski, looking at overload baseballs and weighted balls, underweight balls, looking at their significant effects on increasing velocity. And, with this, I think this is kind of where I can get into maybe some misconception and the understanding of the science. And Mike and Glenn touched on this as well, that it's not that simple. I have that graphic on the left where it says weighted balls equals increased velocity. Standing here, I'm not actually going to be able to say that. I actually disagree with that statement. I do not think that, scientifically you can just say, and again, this is me as an employee of Driveline Baseball saying that, no, I don't agree with that statement, that, it's as simple as just being able to say weighted balls equal velocity. And I actually think statements like that are very, kind of like damning and counterproductive to what we're trying to do here, because there is that tendency right now. Everyone out there, especially players, I'm sure you've all experienced, are looking for that magic pill to make them better. And why wouldn't they? I was a player myself. I went through the same things. I was always looking for that next thing that was going to take me to the next level, increase my velocity, whatever it did. I'm not going to stand here and say that weighted balls are the answer to increasing velocity. I don't agree with that statement, even though you can see on that right column that many of those studies showed a significant increase in velocity. But again, like Mike said, there's a lot of nuance to it. There's a lot of those being from older studies, the way they were carried out. A lot of it is going to be about the methodology and the implementation and how it's actually being used. And I think that is an important piece of all of this and a huge misconception. I think the easiest analogy that I always use with people when I'm talking about weighted balls is I see them as just another implement. I see it as a tool in the weight room, right? I liken it to a deadlift, a squat, anything. that we use. It's a tool in our toolbox as coaches, as trainers, to help make athletes better, to improve their performance. That's all it is. If an athlete walked in to the weight room and he hadn't deadlifted in 3 months, and he just loads up the bar with his 1 rep max and he pulls it without a warm up, I don't look at the deadlift, the exercise. I don't look at the weights, and I don't demonize the weights for causing that injury. If there is an injury, right? If that athlete like blows out his back, I don't get mad at the weights. I don't demonize the deadlift. I probably demonize myself and get mad at myself for being a terrible strength coach in that environment and allowing that to happen. You know, it's just an implement. If used correctly, can be beneficial, right? But that's the caveat, that it needs to be used appropriately. There are techniques, ways, programming, periodization to properly implement weighted balls, just like there are proper ways to use the deadlift, use the squat, bench press to kind of like make your athletes better and improve them. Because that's our focus, and especially at Driveline, and I myself personally, that is my focus, is player development, making athletes better, making them perform better, so that they can go out and win on the field. And I think there's another misconception here, especially with what we do at Driveline a lot of times, is that we are very velocity centric, and we are. Velocity is key. You know, Mike mentioned that as well, that velocity is huge. Everyone is focused on it. You know, people are searching about it all the time. Velocity is very important. It's the ticket to the show. So we obviously care about it. It's also very immediately tangible, and we can measure it right away. We can put a radar gun up and see how hard someone is throwing. That does not mean, because we are so velocity centric, that doesn't mean that we completely ignore injury risk and anything for that, right? You can't throw hard if you're hurt. And me personally, I value that really highly with my experience of having Tommy John surgery. So we kind of look at both of those things, and we factor them in, even though oftentimes we'll, you know, tend to very exclusively talk about velocity. I completely understand that. But we start with performance indicators within the metrics. So for instance, within the biomechanics lab, and where I typically, you know, work and focus, we're focused on how is mound velocity changing over time. You know, in the top right, I have that's actually just a clip of some data from summer 2019 last year, where we're monitoring how mound velocity was changing across you know, our entire training population. You know, hundreds of athletes come through our door every summer, and then in the off season as well. And we're monitoring how velocity is changing, but also that metric in the middle is one that we use a lot. It's what we call basically efficiency. We're trying to quantify how many miles per hour can the athlete produce per unit of normalized stress. Mike and Glenn also mentioned this, that those various torques, those joint moments and kinetics are going to increase. They correlate with velocity. As velocity goes up, more stress goes up. So what we do is we try to attach velocity into that kinetic equation and understand, you know, are you able to produce velocity more efficiently at potentially a, you know, lower amount of normalized stress. That's so we take those two kind of data points, you know, and again, this is just in the biomechanics lab, and we capture data around that. We then analyze it, we process it. We use OptiTrack cameras and Visual 3D post-processing. We then take that signal and we compare it to elite normative ranges. We are very fortunate at Driveline that some of the best throwers in the world just walk through our door and pay us to collect their data and add it to our database. And that has helped us understand, you know, where are the differences in throwing techniques and kinematics, and what are the elites of the elites doing. We're able to do that, you know, as Stan mentioned, in the Dominican Republic and Japan, and understand and experience many cultures and ways of throwing, and then take that signal and compare it to, you know, anyone who just comes in for an assessment, right? And from there, we follow a pretty simple model of just assess, monitor, retest, and then we reevaluate. And I think the last piece is important. Sometimes it gets missed on, but this is where weighted balls kind of fits into our scheme. We start with that comprehensive assessment and collecting data in the biomechanics lab, collecting data in the weight room, on the PT table, functional movement screens, all of that, trying to understand everything about where that athlete is at that point in time, taking into account injury history, backgrounds. We allow our throwing trainers and our skill coaches to take high-speed video and understand the way that they move in the drills. All of that information is taken and then put together to develop a roadmap and a program for that player's development. It's individualized for them, and we base it off of our training data of working with players for years now. And the more that we work with players and we assess and we retest, we're able to understand and iterate on that program and build out more, individualized programs that can work and cater towards more athletes. And throughout that process, we're constantly monitoring. We're trying to understand, is this athlete in a deficit? We're using a lot of feedback tools like obviously radar guns and velocity to get a better picture of, do we need to back off right now? Do we need, maybe is it best to push harder with this guy? We do it in the weight room all the time, and we do it with weighted balls as well. We then follow that with a comprehensive retest. That's our check to see how are we doing our job. We're on the right, I've got some overlays of biomechanics data, looking at athletes like 6 weeks apart, 8 weeks apart, 12 weeks apart, trying to identify changes and see what's going on and make sure that we're moving and trending in the right direction. And I think the last piece that we do is something that I take a ton of pride in. Driveline that we do, and I think it gets missed a lot, is where we reevaluate our program. I work very closely with our quantitative analysts and our other analysts, and are constantly trying to audit the way that we do things. That's not necessarily a great job to have, because you can piss a lot of people off and they're not going to be happy when you're just blunt with them and you're telling them that, hey, the numbers aren't lying. We're losing here. We're not winning. I would be lying if I told you all that every athlete that has walked through the door of Driveline baseball has gained velocity, has not gotten injured. We have messed up athletes. Athletes have walked through the door and they have left not better than when they came in. And understanding and knowing why is a huge part of what I do in terms of reevaluating the program and objectively looking at, are we doing our job? Finding those outlier cases where the program that we developed didn't work, and then, changing it. Weighted balls just happen to be a tool that helps us effectively do our job. And as long as velocity in gym and efficiency continue to trend up, as long as athletes continue to have results, we'll probably continue to use them. Now, if something changes, we will be open to completely throwing it out and getting rid of it. If weighted balls didn't work, we would not use them. We'd be investigating other implements and other modalities, but we have a lot of success with our program and the way that we do that. And I think a good example actually is just within the last few months, we released a preprint where about a year and a half ago, actually, we had this idea that one of the specific drills that we did with weighted balls, the rocker drill, was actually putting athletes in inefficient positions. It was compromising them mechanically. And so we investigated that, and we looked at variations and acute kinematics compared to their mound work. And we were trying to identify, like, is this creating inefficient positions? Could we potentially be messing up athletes with this drill? And that actually is what we found. We looked further at it, and we eventually came to a point where we, more or less like eliminated that training, that drill from a lot of the programming that we do because we found that it just wasn't working. We would do the exact same if we eventually came to a place with weighted balls. As far as some experience and considerations, things that we do that are very important in terms of like building out a safe and effective weighted ball program, we start with athlete education and instruction. I think throughout a lot of these considerations that I'm going to mention, that deadlift example is going to reign true. Athlete education and instruction, understanding how to execute the drill, understanding the best way to go about it is a huge part, right? You can't get mad at the athlete that gets hurt in the weight room when you never taught them how to properly lift. And so we take a lot of pride in walking people through the drills, using video, and helping educate them in how to execute the drills. And then fortunately though, with some of the weighted the heavier weighted implements, those like 2-pound, 4-pound balls. We see a lot of success with not having to use that many cues and coaching there. A lot of times with athletes, we've had to overcome this with language barriers, working with players in the Dominican Republic, doing some coaching. But fortunately, at like that level, the elite level, we see a lot of players just pick up the ball and be able to execute it, effectively almost immediately, or it only takes a few throws for them to better execute the drill because of that constrained overweighted implement being in their hand. Focus on proper on-ramping too. That's another piece that is going to be a big part about this. Again, same exact thing for the deadlift example, right? You would want to build up to, lifting at higher intensity. The same thing is going to go for weighted balls. You're going to want to build up and slowly on-ramp your way into being able to throw the weighted balls at higher intent, to train yourself into being able to, handle those workloads and workload management with that. We prioritize warm-up and recovery. And I think this is a pretty common misconception about weighted balls. The weighted balls and the way that we use them specifically, they're kind of like the centerpiece of our training program. It's like every day is primarily a weighted ball day or that kind of a thing. It's really the endpoints of the training day. The warm-up and the recovery are going to be key aspects of that, where you're trying to get the body into a position to then focus on what matters that day, which is going to be throwing the 5-ounce baseball, and then recover it down afterwards. So it's not necessarily the centerpiece of that workout. It's actually kind of the endpoints and building up that throwing economy and throwing fitness. We individualize the program. As I mentioned, that's part of the assessment process and understanding from the training data what we've learned to tailor it to the athlete. Weighted balls can be effective, but not every single program or every single weighted ball is going to be effective for every athlete, right? I think the question that Stan plans to ask is a great one. Like, are weighted balls effective, or do you believe they're safe with youth populations? I don't have necessarily an answer to that. But is there I also think it's more nuanced than that. It's going to be tough to just say like weighted balls, thumbs up or thumbs down kind of a thing, because there's a ton, right? I'm probably not going to give a 13-year-old kid the 2-kilogram ball that weighs 4 pounds. But could a 6-ounce ball or a lighter version of a weighted ball be effective? I think so. We comprehensively test and retest. This is important. If you're just programming and training athletes without testing and retesting and kind of like monitoring to see where they are and where they get to and what's changing over time, you're blind for the most part. You're not able to evaluate what you're doing, and that monitoring process is huge too. Even though we feel confident in the programs that we lay out, we're very, very adaptable, and that's a huge piece of weighted ball programs. Understand when an athlete has gone into a deficit, when he needs a deload, when he's so far away from being able to compensate for the training regimen that you need, and he just needs to take some time off and deload accordingly. And those are just some main considerations and kind of how we go about weighted ball programs and making them safe and effective. Again, want to thank Stan and Nancy for this. This is like really awesome for me. I'm incredibly appreciative. If anyone has any like lingering questions after this, please feel free to reach out to me, put my email and my socials there, and any other resources that you might be interested in. But again, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. So we're going to go on to Brandon Erickson. We're still going to want to have some questions at the end. We're getting a tad long here. I apologize. Brandon Erickson is a fellowship-trained orthopedic surgeon in sports medicine. He is a New Jersey native and played football at University of Notre Dame as a wide receiver. Couldn't get his stats from him. He wouldn't give them to me. Medical school at Tufts University. Rush University Medical Center residency in orthopedic surgery, and did a fellowship at HSS in New York and was an assistant team physician for the New York Mets. Numerous studies, especially in the last 2 years. Dr. Erickson has published quite a few articles, especially in his last 2 years when he was at HSS, and continues to do so. He's working with Major League Baseball, and recently did this study, which I hope he's going to talk about in regards to underweighted balls. And he's the assistant team physician for the Philadelphia Phillies. Dr. Erickson, and here's his wife, Carrie.
All right, thanks, Dan. All right, Nancy, you got the screen?
Yep, you're good to go.
All right. So, Stan, I appreciate you having me on. Nancy, thanks for organizing this. Stan asked me to give, a 5-minute talk on training with lighter balls, so we'll keep it to 5 minutes. I have no relevant disclosures to this particular talk. And so the question becomes, why should we bother? Why do we bother discussing lighter and heavier balls? And I think the people who have spoken before me have done a good job talking about that. So I'm not going to belabor the point. We know the pitch velocity is a very important metric that we use, and everybody's trying to find a way to increase the velocity. Now, if you look here, this is some data from Fangraphs, and what you can see is the average fastball velocity in 2010 for the Major League Baseball team that was throwing the hardest was 92.4 miles an hour. As it progressed over to 2019, you can see that the average fastball velocity that a Major League Baseball team is throwing, the team that throws the hardest, is up a little over almost 2.5 miles an hour. So it's up to 94.7. So you can see that fastball velocity in Major League Baseball is obviously going up over the last 10 years. Interestingly, fastball, like the percentage of fastballs that are being thrown, are actually going down. So if you look at 2010, 63% of pitches were fastballs for the team that threw the most percentage of fastballs, and this was down to just under 60% in 2019. So we're talking about injury risk factors. We're talking about how important velocity is. You can see that even though fastball percentage is dipping over the last 10 years, fastball velocity is going up. And there's a thing, I'm not going to belabor the point again, but obviously we're talking about weighted balls, and the question is, do these weighted baseball programs, do these weighted ball programs help you increase velocity? And if they do, are they doing it at the cost of injuries? And so we were thinking of a study where we tried to say, okay, maybe the weighted balls can increase the amount of stress in the shoulder and elbow, obviously different than what Glenn was talking about before. But we were thinking maybe lighter balls wouldn't produce the same amount of stress in the shoulder and elbow and may give you some of the same results. So the purpose of our study was to determine whether a training program that utilized lighter baseballs as opposed to heavier balls could increase fastball velocity without increasing injury risk in the participants. And what our hypothesis was that this training program with the lighter balls would increase velocity, but we wouldn't see a significant number of injuries in these guys. And so we took male baseball pitchers aged 10 to 17. They were eligible to participate. And we asked the players and the parents beforehand about history of injury, current injury status, things like that would exclude them from participating. I did a brief screening physical exam on these kids to make sure they were relatively healthy. And we excluded them if they had a current injury, recent surgery, weren't cleared to throw, all the things you would assume they'd be excluded from a throwing program for. The throwing program that we implemented was divided into 3 phases, right? So there were 15 weeks, and there were 25 sessions over those 15 weeks, okay? Every player, regardless of age, went through the same schedule, the same session, so everybody did the same program, okay? And this took place over the winter. And we asked every player after every session if they sustained an injury, and we defined an injury as any issue that caused them to miss time, so either leave the session early or miss the next session we defined as an injury. And so we grouped the kids into 3 groups, 10 to 12, 13 to 14, 15 to 17. And we only had 1 group training per day. So each group did 2 sessions per week. So 6 days of the week, 1 day of the rest for the coaches. But there were no groups that were training on the same day, okay? We had pitch velocity tested at 4 different time points during the study. So session number 3, 10, 17, and 25. And by this, we had the kids warm up. Then they threw 5 fastballs at maximum effort that were recorded on a drug machine. And then we took the average of this as their fastball velocity. Mike alluded to some of the data, the information about the program. I put the link here to the study in case you're interested in it, what happened at each session, what the specific protocols were. I'm not going to go over that right now. So results from this study. So we had 48 kids that wanted to participate. We had to exclude 4 of them. So one didn't have any baseline velocity data because he missed the 3rd session when they threw. One didn't complete the program because he broke his ankle while he's playing basketball. One kid moved, and then one kid was throwing in back-to-back showcases, and after the second showcase developed some biceps soreness, and it caused him to miss a couple of sessions. So we excluded him because he was doing something outside of the program that caused him to get hurt. So we had 44 male pitchers, 10 to 17. You can see the average age here that completed the training program. What we found was, fortunately, that nobody during the course of this program sustained an injury. Okay, whether that was during the med ball portion to start with or during the lighter ball training program towards the end, nobody had a shoulder or elbow injury. We saw that velocity went up, and then it went up throughout the course of the program and all our time points. We found an average change in velocity of almost 5 miles an hour over the course of the program. And interestingly, of all the kids that participated, 43 of the 44 kids, or 98%, wound up going up in velocity. They all didn't go up 5 miles an hour, but every kid except for one kid at least had some gain in velocity. You can see here, you can see where the baseline velocity is at, and then as it goes up sequentially with each session, all of those increases were statistically significant, as you can see on the right there. Of course, there are some limitations to this study, and this is not a randomized study. This is just something to generate some conversation, to get us talking about lighter balls a little bit. The pitchers in our study were, of course, 10 to 17, so you can't necessarily say that these results are going to hold water if the kids are older than 17 or younger than 10. We didn't have a control group, okay? So we didn't have a control group that used regular balls, and we didn't have a control group that used weighted balls. So I can't tell you that this program made them increase their velocity any more than a weighted ball program would, any more than a regular 5-ounce baseball program would. I can tell you that there were no injuries in this group. So even though we didn't have a control group of weighted or regular balls, there's no way that they could have a lower injury rate than this. Now, they could also have an injury rate of 0, so this isn't to say that this would have a lower injury rate than they would, but they certainly could not have a lower rate than what we had. So the take-home points from this 15-week program, and similar to what Mike said before, it's definitely a training program. It's not just a weighted ball program for a couple of sessions with really heavy balls, but doing this training program with lighter balls instead of weighted balls significantly improved pitching velocity without causing any injuries to the shoulder and the elbow. And so I would tell you that lighter baseballs should be potentially considered as an alternative to weighted balls when you're talking about trying to increase a pitcher's velocity. Thanks, Dan.
Great. Thank you very much. Our last speaker is Eric Cressey. Oops, bad, sorry. Eric Cressey is the president and co-founder of Cressey Sports Performance in Massachusetts and in Florida. He got his BS in the University of New England with a double major in exercise science and sports fitness, a master's degree in kinesiology at University of Connecticut, certified strength and conditioning specialist, and he's authored over 500 articles, published 5 books, co-created 4 DVDs that have been sold over 60 countries. Don't want to do his taxes. He serves on the advisory boards for both the IYCA and the Precision Nutrition, and is baseball consultant to New Balance. He served as a strength conditioning coach to the USA Baseball under 18 national team that won the World Cup in 2015 in Japan. And he is now the director of player health and performance for the New York Yankees. Eric?
All right. Well, thank you very much, Stan, for organizing this, and to Nancy for helping out with pulling this all together, and certainly to my co-presenters. Good lineup to be associated with, and a lot of people I've read their work and been fortunate to collaborate with some of them over the years. So really honored to be a part of this. Weighted baseballs are something that are actually pretty near and dear to us. We kind of have a running joke. Kyle Bodie at Driveline's a good friend, and I think we've emailed back and forth since probably 2008, 2009. So as you'll learn, we founded our first facility in Massachusetts in 2007. And, I wrote my first weighted baseball program in 2008. And to be honest, it was very much throwing darts. It was taking a leap of faith because it wasn't really done. So here we are 12 years later, and people will ask, do you do Driveline? And I say, we did Driveline before Driveline existed. So I always have a good laugh with Kyle and enjoy spending time with him, and certainly appreciate the great work that Anthony just presented on. So this is something we talk about a lot. And I just wanted to kind of outline something that we'll utilize or how we'll utilize it in our overall programming philosophy. I should let you know I have no disclosures. My only disclosure is that I have 3 kids ages 5 or below that may be yelling in the background. So we're doing our best to corral them, but I'm sure a lot of you at home are probably dealing with those same struggles right now. So bear with me. I think this is an incredibly important study that we all need to effectively come across. And it's actually more of a review to look through. It's a great work from Robert Newton's lab. Some of the best information you can absolutely find about power, because at the end of the day, that's what weighted ball stuff is. It's a power training modalities. Throwing a baseball is power training at its finest, just in a very specific initiative. And certainly we can, go down different rabbit holes, whether it's talking about where you live on the force velocity curve and whether your sagittal plane power initiatives are going to carry over to rotational power endeavors like throwing and hitting. But I think this is a really, really important study that we look at. And this will be the only time I read a slide at you, but I think it's really important to remember. So they outlined 4 key principles for power development. The first is that a fundamental relationship exists between strength and power, which dictates that an individual cannot possess a high level of power without first being relatively strong. Okay? I always talk to our athletes, I wrote about this in my first book back in 2006, that strength is really the foundation to the pyramid. It's like the size of the glass, and all the other athletic qualities you have, whether it's power, stability, endurance, all those different things, they're derivatives of strength. So if you're weak, you can't be powerful, right? Power is, obviously how quickly you display that force. If you don't have force, you're not going to be powerful. So we have to appreciate that strength is a crucial foundation for power development. Okay? Consideration of movement pattern, load, and velocity specificity is essential when designing power training programs. Back around 2009, 2010, I wrote an article for T Nation, and I made an observation. It was kind of what I learned in 2009 article. And I talked about that I think power is plane specific. I'd seen so many baseball players over the year who rolled in with an 18-inch vertical jump, but somehow threw 95, that it just didn't make sense to me. And sure enough, when you put them in rotational initiatives, whether it was throwing a med ball or doing some kind of plyometric activity outside that sagittal plane, they tested very, very well. And obviously they made their money rotationally, whether it was throwing or hitting. So I threw that out there, and what was interesting is not long after that article was published, Graham Lehman, he was doing his master's thesis work, I think it was the University of British Columbia, and actually had a great article published in 2012 in the Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research that actually showed that power was in fact plane specific, and they looked at throwing velocity, the correlation to, basically rotational med ball throw for distance, like a lateral hop for distance, and the correlations between velocity and broad jumps and sprinting speed were less than stellar. So it goes to show us that specificity really matters in the context of power development. And I think that's an important consideration as we're making this weighted baseball, discussion come to life. This is the third one. This is the whopper. It's vital to consider the individual athlete's window of adaptation for each neuromuscular factor contributing to maximal power production when developing an effective and efficient power training program. A training program that focuses on the least developed factor contributing to maximal power will prompt the greatest neuromuscular adaptations and therefore result in superior performance improvements for that individual. Pick the lowest hanging fruit. Okay, where do we live in this force velocity world where we can get the most benefits? And in my next slide, we'll explain that a little bit more in detail, but you have to make sure you prioritize the important things. And we have different initiatives that we can test these things on in a grand scheme of things. Vertical jump test, where we look at a counter movement jump versus a bounce drop jump to look at, the long versus the short stretch shortening cycle. And certainly force plates are becoming more and more prevalent in baseball, but it's just part of a bigger discussion. And last but not least, a key consideration for the long-term development of an athlete's maximal power production capacity is the need for an integration of numerous power training techniques. This integration allows for variation within the power meso/microcycles while still maintaining specificity, which is theorized to lead the greatest long-term improvement in maximal power, right? Which basically tells us that we have various power initiatives that we need to utilize throughout the year. This is the concept of, in-season, off-season, building to peak at the right times. And obviously it's part of the discussion of year-round throwing programs and where we find rest for our athletes. Certainly how hard do we push them at different times of the year. So let's talk a little bit about this in more detail. And I think the best thing we can do is let's go to an example. And I look at the sprinting community. I've used this several times over the years. A lot of people on this call have probably seen me use it at a seminar or better online. I have a longer YouTube clip on it. But if you just look at how elite sprinters are built, they work along this continuum where to the far left, you have, the absolute speed end of the continuum. That's sprinting, that's jumping, classic plyos. At the other end of the spectrum, you pick up heavy things, right? You squat, you deadlift, you move crazy weights. And what we realize is, there's also stuff in the middle, right? Maybe it's a jump squat with 30% of your 1RM squat, where we're working more at the speed strength end of the continuum. And then obviously strength speed stuff, things like the Olympic lifts. Obviously there are scenarios where you might do loaded box squats or, trap bar deadlift jumps that are at a higher percentage, or just a trap bar deadlift versus band at, 70% of 1RM. The point is that there's benefits to be gained all along this continuum, but we have to take into account two really important factors. The first thing is you throw this out the window when an athlete is weak and untrained. So when we talk about the 10-year-olds in the study that was just referenced, or we talk, even about some of the, the high school kids in some of Mike's research earlier on, like, yes, they were involved in resistance training. How long were they involved in resistance training? And I was fortunate to do my master's thesis at the University of Connecticut. And, we had studies where we had to be meticulous about making sure that we assessed trained subjects and that we utilize them, because the windows of adaptation are so dramatic early on in a training career that, they can get strong on as little as 40% of 1 rep max, whereas someone who's a year into a strength training program can't do that. So the first rule is strength buys you a seat at the table. You have to have some foundation level of strength to even have to worry about this continuum. And then the second thing that we come to is we realize that there are a lot of athletes who, because of the nature of their sports, have lived to the far left of this continuum. During 2003 to 2005, during my master's degree at the University of Connecticut, I actually spent much more of my time working with basketball and soccer. And we were fortunate to have, I believe it was 7 lottery picks over the course of 3 years from our basketball program. So we had not just freaky athletes on a basketball court, but we had kids that rolled in who were the best in America. I can remember Rudy Gay, who's had a great NBA career, coming out on his first day as a freshman. And what we realized about a lot of these athletes is they live their entire life. They had just been on courts, basically at the absolute speed end of the continuum. So what we realized for them is that the best thing we could do to help them was bring them all the way to the right. That first semester was all about building a foundation of strength, because it gave them joint stability so that we could teach them more advanced concepts and they could acquire new skills and get into the positions and postures that we needed to be successful athletically. But what we also realized is that once we brought them all the way to the right end of the continuum, all of a sudden we could make much more gains in the context of the things in the middle. So once you have a foundation of strength, training strength speed, it actually holds water. So you have to appreciate where athletes are in their training career. And the ideal here is, if we're talking about professional baseball players and college baseball players who are on this call, certainly these athletes who have multiple years of strength and conditioning under their belt, particularly in ideal scenarios where there's continuity and all that, they should be able to make the most of this entire continuum if they've basically built that foundation. Now, if we're talking about a 25-year-old athlete who's trap bar deadlifting 185 for 3 reps and really struggling, then that's a discussion of, it's time to go make those gains you should have gotten when you were 15. But for the most part, we can benefit from a huge chunk of this. Now, we have to be careful, because I'm not sure about you, but I'm not gung-ho about having our pro athletes, do Olympic lifts, in a throwing population. I don't love the idea of throwing a barbell on guys' backs and that, kind of classic internal impingement position. So we have to be careful with our exercise selection, but we also have to be cognizant of how it applies to rotational sports, whether it's pitching or hitting. We still have the same derivatives above, but I think what we have to look at is, how do we train this continuum of power? Obviously to the far right, we have our strength training. That's still our absolute strength initiative. And certainly we have to be cognizant of what we utilize in our throwing populations. We're not going to be, bench pressing 350 and all that. But, if you look at the far left end of the continuum, traditionally it's been 5-ounce baseballs. And we could argue that underweight baseballs actually shift us even further to the absolute speed end of the continuum, similar to, overspeed running or something along those lines. So certainly in a consideration there. So a lot of athletes have come in, particularly our Latin American athletes who may not have had access to great training facilities before they were signed to play professional baseball. We need to bring them pretty far to the right end of the continuum. And then we can start to have some fun with the sexier stuff in the middle, right? So obviously strength speed, you can hit stuff with med balls. Proteus is a technology we're using more and more, kind of a concentric way to train rotational power, in multiple planes. So that's something to really excited about. Certainly VersaPulley, works you pretty hard at that strength speed end of the continuum with an emphasis on eccentric overload. And I think where weighted baseballs really come in is in that speed strength end of the continuum, right? It's not 5 ounces, but it's not a medicine ball. It's somewhere in that sweet spot. And I think people can really start to benefit from them, as long as they're used in the right volume at the right time with the right person. And that's the key qualifying criteria. And that's what I'm going to delve into a little bit more. But I do think it's important to appreciate, that we have to ask this question, are weighted baseballs magnifying things, or are we just continuing what was already a frustrated, trend? Dr. Fleisig gave a presentation earlier, and, he even had great research back in 2006. So this is an interesting dynamic because I'm 38 years old. This study looked at the time period that ended when I wrapped up high school in 1999. That's when I left for college. And over the course of that time, we expanded in Major League Baseball from 26 to 30 teams. And if you look at the way the injuries unfolded, it wasn't just that there were more injuries, because that could have just come out in the wash with more teams. But we actually also saw that every injury lasted longer. So the injuries became more significant. So that was a 10-year period where there's some pretty dramatic changes to baseball. And I want you to appreciate that this took place 8 years before we opened our first facility in 2007. Okay, and I'll talk to you about that in a second. But it's also important to appreciate that, in some of that same discussion, Dr. Andrews, had 184 shoulder and elbow surgeries in 95 to 99, and then 624 in 2000 to 2004. So this continued to surge while I was in college. Before I was even done my grad degree, it doubled in the professional crowd. It was about 4 times in college and then 6 times in high school. So this trend got really bad from 89 to 99. And then from 99 to 2004, it more than doubled again, it seems like. Now, here's where this is an important consideration. This is our first facility in 2007. Don't look too closely. You might actually need a tetanus shot. If you went to the bathroom, our restroom door was an old shingle. This was the bare bones opportunity to get a business off the ground in Hudson, Massachusetts. The most aesthetically appealing part of our building was a trash can. So we built this thing from the ground up, and here we are 13 years later. We train guys from all 13 organizations. We have multiple staff members that have been hired by major league organizations. But I illustrate this because what I want you all to realize is that in 2007, there was nothing out there on the internet about weighted balls. The only guy I knew of in 2007 that was using them in the baseball world for high-level development was Derek Johnson at Vanderbilt. And, DJ was not a guy who had a Twitter profile. I don't think Twitter was even really that strong back then. This was the kind of thing where you had to scratch and claw to find things. So I wrote my first weighted baseball program in 2008, and it was very much throwing darts. And what I think we did well in hindsight, I disagree with some of the things I did back then, but the one thing I did do intelligently when I wrote that was that I eased into volume. And I made sure that we only used it with athletes who I thought were physically prepared. They had a good training age, and we tested the waters, right? It wasn't the first thing we did. We started playing catch with a 5-ounce baseball in the off season, and then we gradually integrated more and more as time went on. And this is an important consideration because this is not just baseball that has seen changes over the course of time. Mark Philippon, obviously world-renowned hip specialist in Colorado, he looked at hockey players and skiers between ages 10 to 11 to 13 to 15, and then the 16 to 19-year-old age groups. And they looked at femoral acetabular impingement and associated labral tears. And look at how the percentages changed over the course of time. It was 37 and 48% between 20 and 12, 63% and 63%, 13 to 15. And then obviously as they got towards the end of their high school career into college, it was 93% and 93%. You look at any NHL hip, they will all have femoral acetabular impingement and labral tears, right? You look at a Larson study in 2013, 87% of high-level college football hips had FAI, only 31% actually presented with symptoms. So, these injuries are going sky high, but here's where this is different, right? We aren't contraindicating hockey and football, right? Certainly we're putting pitch counts into the baseball world and hoping that it will protect players in a similar vein to how we are, limiting year-round hockey, how we're being cognizant of what's happening in football and football weight rooms. But you don't see people out there contraindicating specific football and hockey training devices like weighted balls have. And I think what we saw in some of these studies as, we've kind of gone through things tonight is appreciated that maybe they aren't quite as stressful as we previously thought. Maybe they actually are something that could apply some of the variability that our young athletes actually need. Bill Hartman's a physical therapist in Indianapolis. I'm sure Bill did this as a stream of consciousness. He actually posted this on Facebook years ago, and it was so good that I literally just instantly copied and pasted it. I saved it for a long-term athletic development presentation I did. He said, in a sporting environment, athletes perform based on learned prediction models associated with experience. Research supports the understanding that motor/movement variability facilitates motor learning and prediction capabilities that determine the ultimate level of performance. Greater movement variability/movement experience is associated with a faster rate of learning and a better prediction modeling. A rare case of where more is better, right? So basically having multiple experiences allows us to adjust to unstable surprise or unpredictable surprises in the world. The nervous system regulates motor variability and responses to perceptions of threat to the human system. Exposure to an unpredictable environment like most sports demands a broad spectrum of movement variability to limit threat and increase the level of sports performance. I think we can all appreciate that this is why our pitchers take PFPs in spring training. This is why we do change of direction work with our pitchers. This is why we do a wide variety of ground balls with our infielders. We want them to be prepared for whatever level of chaos life throws at them off the field or on the field. Building on that, early sports specialization intentionally restricts motor variability and movement exploration, and therefore limits motor learning and prediction modeling. Limited motor learning and prediction modeling results in novel experiences in a sporting environment being perceived as threatening, and the nervous system will limit human movement system variability to perceived demands of the sporting activity as a means of protection. Limitations in human system variability limit ultimate sports performance. As we all know, early sports specialization is in conflict with optimal long-term development of young athletes. So none of these things are particularly surprising. Maybe Bill just organized it, in a very user-friendly format to sequentially make an important point. But I think the question we have to ask is, if we know all this is true, then why can't we look at weighted baseballs outside the lens, of a means of of applying movement variability? How is this not just a way for us to give our athletes a little bit more adjustability in their systems? And the problem is because they've been sensationalized as an inappropriate way of, basically taking a haphazard approach to long-term development. We have a problem where we like to vilify the implement instead of actually vilifying the application. And this is what we expect of our baseball players, right? We want absolute consistency, right? We want repeatability. We want the same exact vertical release height. We want comparable extensions. We want everything to look the same because we want Albert Pujols to look bad when he doesn't know which of these 6 pitches is coming his way, right? But for some reason, as we work through our pattern, we have to reconcile this with this concept of early sports specialization. We need a very specific action repeated over and over again on a baseball mound, and we have to reconcile that with the fact that they need to experience a wide variety of movements. And this is the challenge with high versus low variability, right? To the far left of this, basically column, or this graph, I should say, if variability is low, you're not going to make a whole lot of progress. Why? Because you haven't been exposed to enough to really adapt, right? If you go in and you just squat every week, it's probably not going to make you that much of a better athlete after a while, right? You're going to get some initial strength gains, but you're not going to have adjustability to changes of direction, to single leg stance, to more hip dominant patterns, things along those lines. But then we add a little bit more variability. All of a sudden, progress takes off, right? We get more joint stability. We get, an ability to adapt to unstable terrain, whatever it may be. But after a while, we give them so much variability, and all of a sudden, athletes don't have a chance to be successful, right? It's too randomized for their own good. They fail too much, and they also get irritated with us because, practice isn't fun anymore because they don't have enough successes. So there's a sweet spot in this variability and progress curve. And I think the problems with high variability, right, is if you take someone who's unconsciously competent in this top left, this is a great diagram. Basically, that's someone who's coming in and you want to teach them how to deadlift, and they walk up to the bar and they look like a scared cat picking it up. It looks terrible, and they have no idea what they did wrong. So they're unconsciously incompetent, right? The first thing we're going to do is we're going to say, hey, here's what didn't work. We're going to fix this and this. So we make them consciously aware of their incompetence. And then we take them to conscious competence. We coach them through a set. We make it look good. And what we do is we complete a crap ton of reps, right? We do a ton of high quality work. We create constraint-based training. We give them external focus cues. We do whatever we need to do from a coaching standpoint to set them up for having lots and lots of really good reps. And then the ideal is eventually they get so many reps under their belt that they become unconsciously competent, right? And that's what we want in our pitchers, right? If they're pitching Game 7 of the World Series, the last thing we want them to be thinking about is their hip load or, where their vertical release height is or something like that. And they've got more important things to worry about. At the other end of the spectrum, we have Japanese pitchers, right? There's a tweet I grabbed off the internet. This guy threw 267 pitches the day after his 514 pitch bullpen, 781 pitches in 2 days. And we wonder why Japanese UCLs don't look great in ages, 11 to 12. There's actually really good research that shows that they tend to be more structurally, I guess, deviated from normalcy than American controls. So that's something we need to be really cognizant of. And the standard deviations are outrageous on how much people practice on average and at extremes at young ages in Japan. So certainly when you have low variability, you do the same thing over and over again, you're going to start sacrificing some arms. And that's a part of the early sports specialization that we talk about. But with that said, I think this is where we have to throw this weighted ball discussion in. You can't truly evaluate a method without considering its application. And I think weighted baseballs are an opportunity for us to give us some variety in the throwing program. And I think one of the challenges that we face in the developmental world, is we hear a lot of people in the clinical realm who like to contraindicate everything, right? They say long toss is dangerous. They say weighted balls are dangerous. Then they say pitching off a mound too much is dangerous. So instantly we have a bunch of guys that throw 83 and only throw out to 120 in flat ground. And meanwhile, all the players in baseball are rolling their eyes when they hear these things, because the overwhelming majority of high-level throwers either have or used to, or do or either used to long toss at a high level. And we're seeing more and more guys that are throwing weighted balls now too. If the guys aren't long tossing, they're throwing the crap out of it on a line between 90 and 150 feet. So I think we need to take into account the reality of development, and then also what we're seeing in the clinical context. I think what we've historically seen right now is we see a lot of orthopedic surgeons who are heavily against weighted balls. And I understand why. They see a lot of people that come in with injuries who say they do weighted balls. Now, what you have to ask yourself if you're in that situation is that a well-controlled study in each case? I would say no, because in many cases, the very athletes that are coming in there are simply the athletes that are drawn to aggressive year-round throwing programs, who have focused on a method as opposed to a comprehensive, well laid out application. So we need to be very cognizant of why we contraindicate. We have to have specific data that I think backs it up. We need to emotionally separate ourselves from the idea that a 5-ounce baseball is the safest just because it's the most familiar to us. We train some NFL quarterbacks, like footballs are substantially heavier. They actually throw them quite a bit more than our baseball guys throw their baseballs on many days. Obviously, they don't throw off a mound, and they play once a week instead of, making a start every 5th day or pitching out of the pen every other day. But these are considerations we have to take into account. And I would just say that the perfect storm, in my experience, and this touches heavily on what Mike presented, the injury, perfect storm with weighted baseballs is hypermobile athletes, guys that acquire range of motion quickly. Those who get too aggressive too soon. Mike talked about seeing a dramatic change in external rotation acutely. Certainly there are going to be people that are further out than one standard deviation on that, who are going to acquire that motion even quicker. And then poor physical preparation. If you don't have the strength to control those end ranges that you're acquiring, those are certainly challenging dynamics as well. And I think above all else, and Matt Blake, I know, is on this call. Matt's our pitching coach at the big league level with the Yankees. And I've been fortunate to work with Matt all the way back to, it was 2009 at our facility in Massachusetts. And we spent a lot of time just sitting down and going over developmental calendars with kids, talking about, when the stress is going to be highest, how you prepare for it, how you fluctuate it over the course of the year, how you shift in and out of that absolute speed, absolute strength calendar. I think that's really, really important. I think you don't take calculus if you haven't mastered basic math. In other words, on that initial absolute speed to absolute strength continuum, like I said, strength buys you a seat at that table. You've got to actually have a foundation of strength before you worry about looking at different power training modalities, weighted baseballs included. And then last but not least, like we talked about in that power study, you have to pick the lowest hanging fruit. For many athletes, that may be getting on a really, really strong rotator cuff, going through a scapular control program. It may be working on mobility. It may be taking rest. It may be gaining 30 pounds. It may be getting in a good strength training program or implementing med balls. But, I think we're inherently sensationalizing things that happen on Instagram instead of really just taking a step back and recognizing that there are some tried and true training principles, that we can exhaust as resources first. So that said, thank you very much for your time. Thank you again to Stan and to Nancy for making this happen. Really flattered that I could join you tonight.
Great. We've gone over, but I'm going to keep moving. People can stay on as long as they want. If you wanted a group of people that don't all agree with themselves and have different ways of thinking, and you wanted a conference like that, that didn't give you one view, you're in the right place. You can see that all these people are experts in their own fields and have great amount of experience and research capabilities, and they have opinions, and that's why I picked these people to do this. So the one thing I caution everybody is don't pick out what you like. Try to listen to everything that has been said. There have been things on both sides of this stuff. We have some questions. I want to quickly tell you the polls that went out in regards to number of formal programs. 56% yes, 44% no. Pitching coaches are the number one by far who actually implement the program of weighted balls at 54%. And in regards to talking about safety on these big general questions on this, interesting, 80% said no to the adolescents on weighted balls, and 80% said, 80+% said yes to the college and pro levels. So for what that's worth, that's what our 800 people had opinions on. So I want to ask one question before Nancy gets into the thing, and it's really, is Mike still there?
Me?
Yeah, okay, good. I didn't see.
Oh, sorry.
This question really is to Mike and to Glenn. We talk about external rotation, increased external rotation, and it's a lot of times implied that increased external rotation increases hypermobility and therefore some problem in regards to the shoulder. When you did the study, Mike, did you look at total motion? I think you did all the motions. Did you get a greater than, the 5% that Kevin Wilk talks about of total motion, internal external rotation ratios between left and right? Can you comment on that? And then also I want Glenn to follow up with, in your presentation last week, you talked about increasing external rotation with long toss past 150 feet. And maybe you can talk about that. Okay, Mike?
Yeah, so in our study, we gained both external rotation and then the subsequent increase in total rotation as well.
Okay. All right. Glenn?
Okay, yes, as you said last week, I mentioned that long toss, maximum distance long toss, correlated with increasing shoulder external rotation, as did these weighted baseball things. So I think, Dr. Erickson and Mike are more medical, but increasing external rotation correlates to more ball velocity is what we've seen. And once we said that about 15 years ago, everyone said, how do I train for more external rotation? The caveat is you can't artificially increase your external rotation at too rapid of a rate. And I think that's why our studies that have increased external rotation in a very short time period also have increased injuries.
And there were several people on the Q&A that asked about Dr. Erickson's study. Do you plan on moving on this? In your conclusion today, you talked about the purpose of the study really was to see if underweighted balls caused any significant problems in a program. Are you going to follow up with that and do more of that and take it on a longer follow-up?
Yeah, so it's a good question. Unfortunately, things have kind of gotten shut down this year because of the virus, but that is something we plan to do. So we plan to randomize it, similar to what Mike did, randomizing to weighted and non-weighted balls. We are going to try to do lighter balls, heavy balls, and just a or just a 5-ounce ball program, and try to see what happens with that. So we can definitively say a change in velocity with weighted, unweighted, and just normal balls at 5 ounces. And then what injury rates are.
Yeah, great. Yeah, I thought that's what you were going to do. We talked about that earlier. But Anthony, what do you think about the idea of just conditioning, strength and conditioning as a way to increase? We've seen Rafael talk about increasing 3 to 4 miles per hour just with a conditioning program. I know that you talked about the importance of the conditioning within Driveline. Maybe you can talk a little bit more about the conditioning, strength and conditioning process before you go into heavy weighted balls.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we use it basically just in conjunction with the weighted ball program. Some considerations that we have with that would be potentially, not having like a high intensity day in the weight room on the same day as maybe like using weighted balls or drills and programming kind of a thing. But it's definitely a huge piece. And I think that's one of the larger aspects with how we train youth throwers in weighted ball programming is understanding where they're at in terms of strength development and in the weight room. There's a bunch of considerations there. And Cressey touched on this as well, being strong enough. I think there's almost a like, being strong enough to have a seat at the table to throw weighted balls up to a certain extent, right? Not all weighted balls are the same, 6, 7 ounce, 8 ounce. I mean, we can go up to 16 ounces, 32, right? As you go higher and higher, there definitely has to be some sort of relative strength needed in order to throw those safely and effectively.
Eric, you got a 15, 16-year-old coming into your performance center and wants to use weighted balls. What's your criteria for deciding to start?
I think the first thing that we got to discuss is the training history. Are they, you look at like a lunge, right? Do they fold up like a lawn chair, or is there actually an element of single leg control? How do they test in their cup strength? Certainly you're looking for any pronounced, specific range of motion limitations. We know obviously Chris Camp's research was awesome. Limited shoulder flexion on a throwing shoulder is going to be a big red flag that we're looking for. Effectively, I'm looking at like, do they have enough strength to actually control that extra rotation? The problem is, honestly, it's similar to like what we see in like the supplement world, right? Where kids, buy a bottle of blue pills at GNC and then they come rolling in and they say, what do I do with these? The same thing happens with weighted balls. I actually got an email this morning from a parent who's, a travel ball program, sent the entire team the exact same weighted ball program, and she wants to know, is this right for him? And it's a testament to her to make sure it's the right fit. But, certainly that's the problem, is that in many cases, we're getting the kids after that point. They've already started it and they're starting up with guys like Mike and I because they're already hurt, and we're trying to put them back together. So, I think there's a lot of important boxes to check. I want to see the delivery too, because if you get an aggressive throwing program in any capacity, it's just going to magnify everything that plays out from the delivery standpoint. So I think that's the importance. I think if you look at, the guys on this call who have facilities, Mike has pitching development, he's got physical therapy, he's got massage therapy, he's got strength and conditioning under the same umbrella. Driveline does it, we do it. You have to be able to check all those boxes at once, because if you overlook one entity, you could be leaving a kid out in the cold.
So Anthony, how do you balance that whole idea with a online program? You have online programs, and maybe Mike can talk about this too, because you get people asking about an online program. Anthony, how do you guys are able to decide if that person should even be able to buy the weighted balls?
Yeah, no, that's a really good point, and especially really relevant right now. We're trying to kind of navigate that ourselves and figure that question out as we go, understanding, what can we do when we're so far away from the athlete? I mean, it really hurts us because we go from such a comprehensive assessment in gym to now having to work with people across the world. We do a lot that we can do with video, obviously, and we're also looking into other potentially like biomechanics related solutions with video. Hopefully the work that we're doing with Modus and pushing forward with AC ratios and workloads could help us understand, weighted ball training and its effects on that regimen. But a lot of it is just going to have to be done with video and understanding the way that they're throwing, and then some sort of remote strength assessment if we can, to get an idea of, how strong are they in terms of like development.
Yeah. Listen, Mike, maybe you should answer that in regards to online programs.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's something that we do a lot with, myself at Champion. I don't think it's in the best interest usually to just slap a template on somebody and just have them kind of follow a program. So we don't do that a ton, to be honest with you. COVID situations may be a little bit different. We're focusing on the strength and conditioning and adapting the programs that they can perform at home with the equipment they have. I think that's the important part of what we're focusing on now.
Good. Nancy, you've got some questions from the group?
Yeah, there are a lot in here. First one, Dr. Fleisig, would you mind if you can explain in more detail on the kinematic change on the flat ground with the weighted ball and normal ball? Obviously, it's different kinetics and kinematics between on the mound and flat ground. Do you think flat ground throw is beneficial for pitchers throwing on the mound at the game?
Okay. All right. Well, first of all, I'm going to give a quick answer, but if anyone wants to, they could email me at asmi.org and find my email address, and I'll send you the paper. But when you pitch from flat ground versus the mound, when you do on the mound, you bend your front knee more and you flex your trunk forward more. So those are the main differences. When you're running, you stay more upright and you don't bend and extend your front knee as much. And then whether that's good or bad, again, the best exercise for full effort pitching is full effort pitching. But you just can't do that all day. I mean, Eric showed someone in Japan doing 500 throws a day, but you can't just keep doing the same thing all day. So to me, varying the weight of the ball and doing long toss and mound versus flat ground, these are all exercises that are similar to pitching, but slight variation on the motions, velocities, and forces. And I think that's part of a full strength and conditioning program where you have a full spectrum from full body workout to sports specific workout. I think weighted balls are close to pitching. They're a sports specific exercise.
Well, how do you feel about the Slinker study that showed that the mound was just as less the same stress as flat ground, meaning that you can get on the mound at the same time that you get on flat ground? I define flat ground as throwing down to a catcher on flat ground. Yeah,
so the Slinker study, I don't think it was perfectly practical because they weren't pitching as hard. And so we published a recent study sponsored by Major League Baseball, which I presented last week, where we looked at we look at college athletes, which is closer to what we're talking about here, pitching from a full mound to lower mound. And as I recall, lower mound, similar mechanics and less stress. And the Slinker one looked at actually flat ground. And I do think as you get lower, it's a little less stress. So it's a good exercise. And again, when you think flat ground, you have to also think about flat ground pitching or flat ground running up and throwing. Flat ground running and throwing will have more ball velocity, as Anthony knows from Driveline, than just standing there and doing a pitching motion. It'll also have more force and torque than just going through the pitching motion. The running up adds ball velocity and also adds stress on the arm.
Nancy?
Do you recommend the use of a Motus sleeve if an athlete is going to do a weighted ball program? And if so, in what capacity do you use it?
Who wants to take that?
I'll just say real quick. My quick answer is I think the Motus sleeve is really good. Anthony's company actually has a partnership with that right now. But I think using the Motus sleeve for weighted balls and also for everything else is a good idea to help monitor, whether you're in a rehab program, whether you're just trying to monitor your full season, because instead of just adding up the number of throws, you're kind of adding up the load, and you can monitor your acute to chronic ratio and your overall load. So it's not perfect, the Motus sleeve, but I think it's better than just counting the number of throws.
Brandon, do you agree with that?
I think the Motus sleeve is a good thing. I think that there's been some studies that have looked at it. It's not quite as accurate as we would hope. I think it, like Glenn said, it provides good reliability for the same pitcher, but probably the amount of force that it's telling you is being generated is not necessarily accurate. That being said, you're able to track something, so it's another data point for us to look at when we're talking about workload. So I think it's a useful tool.
Mike, do you use the Motus sleeve at all?
Yeah, and I think Glenn kind of brought this up a couple of times, like alluded to the point a little bit. I wouldn't use it to say like a kid can or can't like there's like a criteria with valgus stress, right? Because like Dr. Erickson, Glenn said, it's not completely valid. It's reliable, right? But it's not, completely valid. But here's the thing you gotta use with the motor sleep or something like that. It's all about workload, right? And Glenn mentioned this. He's like, there's long toss, there's different weighted balls. Like Eric talked about like variability and stuff like that. They're all like a dose. But here's the equivalent that I always bring up. When I go, they get these new like frozen yogurt places, right? And bear with me, this is gonna make sense. They get these new frozen,
with the grill bag.
they get these new frozen yogurt places that you go to, right? I still go there. I get like chocolate. Maybe I'll throw some sprinkles on there, like nothing crazy. My kids come in, they get in there and they go to everything. They throw everything they can on there, right? And then they overdose. What do you think the sugar is in their sundae versus my sundae? So my sundae is a prescribed dosage of sugar, right? There's overdoses of that dose. It's all medicine. It's all physics. It's all specificity of dose.
Eric, Yankees use motor sleeve, and in what capacity?
Yeah, there's certainly scenarios where they have. In full disclosure, this is my first year too, so I'm still learning names, to be honest. But with that said, yes, they have been prevalent. I wouldn't say that they're, for instance, out there as much as like Mike and Ben Hansen are using with the White Sox. So I think it's a very individual case specific thing, but that's not to say that workload isn't being monitoring in different ways.
Yeah, I think workload, of course, is a whole nother issue, another really good topic to talk about. Just defining what workload is and what should actually go into the equation of workload is controversial. Nancy, another question?
Dr. Reinold, would you say some weighted ball programs are safer or more friendly for pitchers with history of injuries for warm-up purposes, such as reverse throws, pivot picks, rockers, etc., being done into a wall as opposed to using weighted balls for the velocity gain purposes with long toss or pull downs?
I think it all just depends on how hard you're throwing. So, the body doesn't care if you're throwing a weighted ball, a rock, a water balloon, anything. It doesn't matter how you're doing it, what position you're in, if it's reverse pickup, if it's a rocker throw, if it's a long toss, it's a pull down. All it cares about is stress. So it just depends on how hard you're throwing it. So if you're doing something partial effort as a warm-up, doesn't matter if it's in a wall or outside or anything like that. If it's a partial effort as a warm-up, then I would say that is less stressful. Safety, that's a whole nother conversation. I mean, I don't know if anything's safe, right? Throwing a 5-ounce ball is unsafe theoretically. So it comes down to stress again. So, the harder you throw it, the more you throw it, the more stress there is.
Anthony, you talked about rocker throws, and if I heard you correctly, you said that you thought some of the rocker throws from a mechanics standpoint might be a little off. Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, that was actually first brought up and theorized by Sam Breen, who's over with the Yankees now, back a year and a half, 2 years ago, was talking about we were seeing a lot of athletes get into like inefficient positions and theorized that it was the rocker, the way that the drill was done by a lot of athletes. And it was not necessarily, it was more a product of the athletes just not doing the drill correctly and it being done incorrectly so much that led to these like mechanical inefficiencies that we were seeing, simply from the perspective of ability to generate velocity later on. And so we made some modifications and some variations to it. We have a foot up variation, other sorts of constraints that we do within that drill, and we still use it, but much less considerably. I mean, if you look back to early Driveline programs, it was like a staple, like a core fundamental piece, and we just evaluated its effectiveness and found that it wasn't necessarily doing what we'd hoped it was doing. So we just adjusted accordingly.
Okay. Nancy, another question?
Could the size of the weighted ball be considered a confounding variable? Is there any significant difference among stress data for weighted balls that are regulation size and larger plyo type balls?
Wow, good question.
I don't know. I hear your question, but we haven't studied the size of the ball, just the weight of the ball. So I don't know.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I also don't know, but I can tell you from personal experience, I would much rather prefer to throw like the smallest object. Like the big ones, not a fan of, and even like the larger, heavier balls. If there's a like smaller version of it, I would much rather prefer to throw that.
Eric?
I was just, the thing I was thinking about less was the size, and I'd say the complaints that maybe we get more often, about guys who maybe don't like it is the, kind of the texture and the squishiness, right?
Right.
There are a lot of guys that always want to feel the seams, and like that just doesn't work if you're throwing against the wall, because you throw seams on it, it's got to be a harder baseball. It's going to come back to you a lot harder than a plyo-care ball. So I would say more often than not, that's what we see a little bit more of. You see guys that tense up and grip too hard, when they're used to throwing with a little bit more of a relaxed hand.
Nancy?
Another one for Mike. I'm wondering how you handle a player that's completely reliant on weighted ball programs when they come to spring training, knowing the prevalence of injury.
Are they good or bad at baseball? Can we get that subtle? I mean, look, my job's never to dictate, and this is a principle we have in all the programs that I'm a part of. It's never to dictate what's right or wrong, because we don't know. I don't know what's right or wrong. I don't know the answers. I've been wrong more than I've been right in my career, and we continue to adjust. So it's hard to dictate those sorts of things. What we do is we monitor. So if somebody comes in and they're overly reliant on it, I will say we probably didn't draft you because we're getting away from that. But we are getting a sense of their overall patterns. If there's somebody that's struggling and, maybe their biggest thing is issues with command, or maybe they're getting tired and maybe they're fatiguing out and they're not so sharp in their pens, maybe we start to use that as ways to introduce it. But I always start these conversations with why, right? You just talk about the why behind everything we do. And we talk about some of the efficiency and stuff like that. And I will say this, I said this with the NCAA trainers yesterday here. Every time as a staff that we get together and we have to have what we believe is going to be a difficult conversation with a player, where we're like, oh man, his hand's going numb, and like his arm's blue after he throws weighted balls. Like, we got to tell him like the science of this, right? And we're all nervous, like, oh man, he's been doing it, he's a big believer, like we're all so nervous about it. We have the conversation with the player, we articulate our why, we show them the data, we show them the science, and almost every time they say, oh, I'll stop. I just thought they were good for me. I thought everybody says it, just do them. So we actually haven't had a lot of difficult conversations with people because we focus on the why.
Usually the why is because I want to throw 94. That's why. Nancy, another question.
Do any of you see a use for weighted balls in more of a rehab athletic training setting, or more just the strength conditioning side?
You want me to hit that, Stan, just real quick on the rehab? Yeah. So post-op, like Tommy John, stuff like that, I personally don't. Remember, a weighted ball just manipulates stress. It's not good. It's not bad. It's not anything. It just manipulates stress. We've built our interval throwing programs, and we're working on getting our new versions kind of published here. We built our interval programs as a strict dosage pattern, right? The second you start manipulating variables like the weight of the ball, or probably the intensity, which is probably going to change with the weight of the balls too, you're going to alter my workload progression, and you're going to probably have some acute spikes in your workload that I'm not looking forward to. So remember, I think it prohibits strength gains. We've shown that in our studies. I don't think it increases arm speed like people say it does, right? There's all these things. I don't think there's a place for it in the rehab process. Now, once they're done in the rehab and we've progressed their workloads and now you are okay, if you want to build that back into like your overall program, that's fine. I mean, I may try to talk you out of it, but it depends on the person.
Yeah, and I also see that as the finishing touches on rehab. I mean, if you're trying to utilize something, and it may be weighted balls, it may be something else, but you're trying to get this guy back to his previous level of performance. Now, we have a study in process now. Christopher Camp is leading it, looking at the perceptions of major league pitchers or professional pitchers on what they think about Tommy John surgery, a whole bunch of different things. One was on weighted balls. And what we found is that the percentage of people who did weighted balls before their surgery and the people who wanted to do it after was only 11% of that people that had weighted balls before. That, I think, is a little bit confounding in the sense that probably the rehab person was telling them you don't want to do weighted balls, whether that's right or wrong or indifferent. But we saw a huge difference in the number of guys who, after they had their Tommy John decided not to do weighted balls, even though they did it prior to. We're not sure exactly what that means yet, but it was kind of interesting to see that drop off of the people who actually did it. Nancy?
Stan, I was going to add one thing, and I think, this is kind of an elephant in the room that I don't think we've touched on, but maybe this is the right place to put it, is like, Mike, you've seen it. I know, the rest of us folks who have been around it, there are professional baseball players who can't play catch right now, where catch play at 60 to 90 feet is absolutely terrifying. I have dents on the side of our building that we just built 3 months ago in Florida to show for it. And, that could be a function of, you get drafted for blowing up radar guns, whatever it may be. I don't think it's unreasonable to say that we've had a generation of kids who have spent a lot of time throwing balls against walls instead of to catch partners. And because catch partners and catchers read spin, they give you feedback all along. When you're 3 feet away, you don't know if you missed 6 feet glove side, whether you yanked it, whether you cut it, whatever you did. And I think that's a very important consideration, not just in the context of development, but I think it's an important consideration in the concept of, like, rehabilitation throwing programs should be about linear success patterns. You should be better on Wednesday than you were on Monday, and you should be better on Friday than you were on Wednesday. They should be steady successes to bring people along. Yeah, there'll be rough days where it's a lateralization instead of a progression, but I think we have to be really careful about, like Mike said, adding more confounding variables to a point when we should A, just be testing the repairs the way we want to, and B, giving them chances to be successful in a long pattern. So, I'm not saying it's right or wrong to throw a weighted ball against the wall. We certainly do it, but I do think that there are too many players out there that are using it for too high a percentage of their throws. What the ideal percentage is, if it's 10% of throws, if it's 20%, I don't know, but you make your money with a 5-ounce ball, and I think that's where your most important throws should always come from.
Anthony, I think there's some studies, maybe you know about it. I've read them someplace. I'm sorry, I can't quote them here, but talked about weighted balls and control and whether they influence the control. I thought there was a couple studies out there, maybe somebody can help me recall it, that looked at weighted balls after a weighted ball program, whether it increased, decreased, and had no effect on accuracy. Anybody?
Yeah, I believe I know what you're talking about. I think there's also potentially some with handball players in proprioception. I think also other just like weighted implements across like sports. I want to say there was something with like basketball and like slight variations maybe in size or weight there. But on our end, like we're trying to investigate that as well to see, can you using a certain weighted ball or a certain size of ball potentially help with command, make the task a little harder, giving them like randomized implements. I know that's something that like Trevor feels very strongly about and does in the off season up here all the time when he's like working on pitches. I think there's also potential for that later on to be used in pitch design potentially. I know that's like a very, very big thing right now, and something we're also looking at is using certain implements, certain constraints to help someone, whether it's size, seams, weight, etc., to get them to a place where they can achieve the pitch that they're trying to design. So we're trying to investigate all of those, trying to understand how they can be used more effectively, geared towards that player performance, and command is obviously a big piece of that.
Just on a different issue, we had a couple people asking about the poll results, and if we could say them again. I will send out to everyone who's registered, I will send out those results from the poll so you can see specifically instead of generalities. I'll send that out after my first cocktail later tonight. So more questions, Nancy. We got more questions. Listen, I'm going to keep going. I see how many people are in the room. There's still quite a bit of people. If the speakers are going to stick around, then we'll keep throwing some more questions out. We'll probably have 3 or 4 more. Nancy?
All right. Has anyone looked at scapular positioning with weighted ball throwing or periscap muscle activation and control?
I don't know of any study, that's for sure.
That's a lot of head shaking. A lot of head shaking. No.
Yeah. I think you probably shouldn't go into advanced programming, whatever that may be, whether it be weighted balls or throwing on the mound, if you don't have scapular control. Period. That would be a no-go for me. Not just on weighted balls. Okay, next question.
All right. So I'm trying to figure out who some of these are too. They didn't put names on them. Okay. Dr. Reinold, what reasoning did you and your colleagues hypothesize for the decrease in velocity achieved by some individuals in the weighted ball group?
I mean, I think part of it is probably that they weren't ready for it, right? They're aggressive, right? I mean, you think about it, it's a change in the aggressiveness of a program. And they don't work in everybody, right? So some people aren't ready for them. We see some people that plateau after some time. We see some people that regress over time. So, I would say that was a big part of it, just that they're maybe not as magical as we think.
Okay, I think we're going to kind of wrap this up right now. I know we didn't get to every question, but there's a lot of repeat questions, and I think we've covered a lot of ground. As a moderator, I try to stay as neutral as I can on this stuff, but as a clinician and someone who's done a lot of the research on this stuff, I do have some opinions, and I think from my perspective, for what it's worth, is that this has to do with tools in the toolbox, and more importantly, the carpenter. We have people out there who are reading Driveline baseball online and taking it upon themselves to develop a for-pay weighted ball program. It's bastardized from Driveline or for some other online thing. And these people should not be doing this. And where they're doing it is in the worst damage from what I see in my community. And that's they're doing it on the 15 and 16-year-olds. So it's not the weighted ball program that necessarily is causing the problems. It's the implementation and instruction that is critical. I think one of the things that we've heard more than anything else is that you have to be prepared to go to this next step. And if you're not prepared, you're going to get yourself in trouble. So in the case of the carpenter and the tools, a nail and a hammer can do a great thing with a great carpentry. With a guy like me, I just put a hole in the wall because it has to do with the person who is instructing these people to do these things. And I think one of the problems that we have here is that we have a lot of people out there in the wild, wild west that are taking it upon themselves to buy weighted balls and then teach 15 and 16-year-olds what to do. And that's a bad combination. And they end up having problems and ending up in rehab and surgery. That's my opinion for what it's worth. Anybody else want to comment on that?
I totally agree with what you just said. I could not have said that better. I think I am scared about weighted balls sometimes. It does make me nervous when guys throw with weighted balls. I think if done properly under somebody who knows what they're doing, the panelists here, I think it can be a tool, but I think you're absolutely right. If you give some weighted balls to 13, 14, 15-year-olds and they try to look up some stuff online and try to use them, I think it's a recipe for disaster.
Mike?
I mean, I would just say, just realize that the majority of amateur players out there aren't doing crap, and they think that doing a weighted ball program is a velocity program. So, if we really want to start flattening the curve, as I said, we got to be careful how we interact, how we sensationalize things on social media, and how we educate the youth that there's a lot of ways to develop velocity, and some that are even more effective than weighted balls without the injury risk.
Yeah, conditioning is hard. It takes a long time. It takes a ton of work to get it to a point. And sometimes I believe that some of these people are taking what they consider a short route, and that's a disaster. Anthony?
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I mean, I saw it all the time as a player and still do, just like showing up to the field, seeing guys on another team doing their version of a pivot pick or a roll-in or whatever drill it is, and it just being like nowhere close to something we would allow to happen in gym. And I think you see that in like public gyms as well, like all the time, walking in and seeing someone with terrible deadlift form. Like that is, again, like not something that we want to see. Unfortunately, with our name on a lot of those products being thrown, we can wear a lot of the blame for those injuries or those when people execute those drills properly. But I do think that's a huge piece, and something that we've been trying to do more and more is that education aspect and getting more information out there about how to do things properly, how to use them more effectively, because we do see success using them effectively and safely.
Glenn, you can't get out of this one.
I think like you said, it's one tool, and to say weighted balls, I want to just do a weighted ball program, it doesn't make sense. You can't look at it in isolation. You have to look at it as part of a full program: strength and conditioning, long toss, bullpen sessions. You can't just count weighted baseballs and add it on without considering how it works with everything else.
Eric, you're last.
No, I think they all hit it on the nail on the head. So I'm just reiterating what was already said. Like, pick the lowest hanging fruit. A lot of these athletes have so many other things that they can focus on, and I think maybe I've been fortunate to see that. Right, we've had 8th graders that have made it to the big leagues. So you look at a long-term athletic development model, and those guys that make it, they don't skip steps. They take care of themselves, in a progressive manner, and the weighted balls can be part of that. They absolutely can be a phenomenal part of it. And I always tell guys, we have Corey Kluber, who's got 2 Cy Youngs. Corey's thrown weighted balls since 2009. Max Scherzer's got 3. Max has never thrown one in his career. There's a lot of different ways to be successful in this game. So you've got to figure out what works for you, but you got to build that foundation before you can make that decision.
Okay, guys, listen, thank you very much. I think this turned out a lot better than I thought it would. I wasn't sure exactly where we're going to go. I think a lot of different ideas and a lot of different perspectives on this, and I think we did a good job. I hope the audience liked it, and we'll know. Just fill out that poll at the end. We need. I'm sorry. Next week, Nancy just is telling me I'm screwing up here. So hang on a second. Let me do one more thing on next week's. Program here. Okay, next week we got thoracic outlet syndrome, which is Mike Reinold's favorite topic. Every time I talk to him, he brings it up. So thoracic outlet syndrome with Dr. Gregory Pearl on the surgical side of this. He's done a lot of surgeries on professional baseball players with thoracic outlet syndrome. Regan Wong, who's a therapist that works a lot with thoracic outlet syndrome from the Texas Rangers. And then Sue Falsoni is going to talk in regards to other ways to treat this conservatively from a Western and Eastern medicine standpoint, including dry needling. So she'll be our next one. She'll be the next ones we handle next week. So hope everybody else comes back. We'll be sending out some information on the next one on Friday. We will have this episode downloaded for video, conteperformance.com. You can get it there and be able to see it anytime you want. All right. Thank you very much and goodbye.
You guys.
Thanks, everybody.